Excellent, thank you. Welcome, members of the public, to the June 12th Open Space Board of Trustees meeting. My name is Michelle Estrella, and I am the board chair. We have a pretty full agenda tonight, so let's get right to it. First order of business is to do our roll call. Then we'll move on to the approval of the minutes. Trustee Carroll.
Present.
Trustee Robinson.
Present.
And Trustee Zuckerman.
Right here.
Trustee Glynn is in Europe right now, so she sends her regrets. And of course, I'm here, so we have 4 trustees present and we have a quorum. Next item is approval of the minutes. And as usual, we will go page by page for comments, clarifications, edits. Page 1, any of those? No? No? Okay. Seeing none, we'll go to page 2. Comments, edits? Okay. Seeing none, I will ask for a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll motion that we approve the minutes from the May 8th, 2024 meeting as written.
I'll second.
See, this month I didn't forget. Yay. Pat on the back. Okay. So tonight we have 3 public hearings.
We have to approve it though, Michelle.
Oh, I got to go do a roll call. Okay, sorry. Thank you. Okay, I got almost there. Okay, so let's do a roll call on the approval of the minutes. Carroll.
Yes.
Robinson.
Yes.
Zuckerman.
Yes.
And I also, I'm getting there, man. All right. I also approve, so that passes unanimously. Thank you. Okay, so the next section is public comment for items not identified for public hearing. We have 3 public hearings tonight on board actions. Management area designations, a disposal, and North Foothills Bikeway. So this is an opportunity for the public to speak up on any item that they wish other than those 3. And Sam and Leah, do we have people signed up? Oh, sorry, yes, let's do that.
No, I was going to say that just as I was getting it up. So I'm glad that you saw that. A few things before I jump into some of the logistics. So I will read through this information. So the city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit this website linked here. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. These will be upheld during the meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. Participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. And then we do have quite a few people who may want to speak in person. If you haven't signed up yet in one of these sections, we have 4 sections this evening for public comment. Please do sign up in one of those sections on this table if you'd like to speak in person. If you're joining us online, you can raise your hand. There's a couple different ways to do that. First, you'll either see a raised hand icon at the bottom of your screen, or you'll see an option to click participants box, the 3 dots on the bottom right, and then raise hand. Okay. So for this first section, this is public comment for items not identified for public hearing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Okay. And we don't have anyone signed up in advance, so I'm going to grab the paper for this one. Okay, so we have two people signed up in advance, signed up to speak in person for this section. First, we have Lori Fuller, followed by Wendy Sweet. So Lori, you can come up to the podium. And we'll let you know. We'll just get the timer started in just a moment. Okay, thank you. We'll get it started now.
Thank you. Take two. So, well, good evening. My name is Lori Fuller. I live at 2995 Carnegie Drive in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm speaking on behalf of Fidos regarding the proposed changes to the seasonal leashing. First of all, we'd like to make clear that this seasonal leashing is not net neutral to the dog community. For one, that this leashing has been extended on all seasonally leashed trails from 2.5 months to 3.5 months out of the year, which is a 40% increase or 40% longer time, which is considerable. And although the proposal removes the restrictions on Dowdy Draw, this trail is not a desirable dog trail, as there is heavy bike traffic on this trail, which most dog owners avoid. And alternatively, Shadow Canyon is not a bike trail and provides an important access route to the South Boulder Peak. These new regulations have been determined based on ecological evaluation of the terrain without any assessment of conflict between bears and dogs. If the concern is bear-dog conflict, it seems that considering historical conflict would be critical information to be evaluated before any regulation change. You know, in our opinion, the Open Space Department has not at all made it clear that there is currently a problem that needs to be solved here. I'd like to also specifically talk about the Skunk Canyon Trail, which was mentioned in the packet, but it was not demonstrated why this trail should continue to be seasonally leashed. This leashing is a legacy restriction that was in place when the trail followed the creek. However, this trail has been moved far outside the Skunk Creek drainage. The beginning of the trail does cross the creek, but this part of the trail is leashed full year round and only becomes off leash well above the bear foraging habitat. As far as Fidos is aware, there hasn't been any bear conflict on this trail since this reroute, as we have requested this information several times. So we're asking for more detail on why this trail continues to be targeted for seasonal leashing, as it doesn't appear to fit any of the criteria for this restriction. So just, you know, in summary, we just want to emphasize that this new policy is absolutely not net neutral to the dog community. And we ask that you please reevaluate the proposed seasonally leashing strategy to ensure that restrictions aren't imposed to solve a problem that doesn't exist and that no restriction is in place unnecessarily. Thank you.
Excuse me. Chair,
Thank you,
can I
Lori.
ask a question, Chair?
Sure.
So before you sit down, you used the term net neutral a couple
Yeah.
of times. Could you just explain to me what you mean by that?
That it's like, you know, we win some, we lose some, but in the end, it's like, it's neutral to the dog community. But in our opinion, that the trails we gained are not really dog-friendly trails, and the trails that we're losing are highly valuable trails, and in addition to the extended month-long leashing period.
Okay, thank you for that
Thank you.
clarification.
Thanks, Lori. I have some questions about that too, but not for you, Lori. I think in the next section, we have an opportunity to talk under matters from the board about things that were in the packet. And what Lori brought to us is an item that was in the packet. No, I'm sorry, never mind. It's later on.
Yeah, we'll have a
It's the
full
matters from the
discussion of
department.
it
Matters
and
from the
under
department.
matters from the department.
We can have a robust discussion about that at 7:45 after we have a presentation. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay, do we have another person?
Yes, we have one more person signed up to speak in person, Wendy Sweet. If you could please come up to the podium. Thank you.
Good evening.
Board of Trustees and OSMP staff. I'm Wendy Sweet. I live in South Boulder, and I'm the Executive Director for the Boulder Mountain Bike Alliance. I'm thrilled to be here tonight to talk about the North Sky Trail. Back on June 7th, 2016, many of us from the biking community showed up at the City Council public hearing to express our support for this trail. It's been a long journey, but we're finally seeing the results of our collective efforts. 8 years ago, BMA made a promise to OSMP to help build and maintain the North Sky Trail. I'm proud to say we've kept that promise. BMA is a small nonprofit supported primarily by individual and business memberships and donations. With just 2 paid staff members, we rely heavily on our network of over 260 dedicated volunteers to build and maintain multi-use trails throughout Boulder County. Our Trails Program Director, Mike Rutter, has spent the last year working tirelessly, building and leading volunteer groups alongside OSMP trail staff. Last summer, BMA covered the rental costs for a mini excavator, enabling Mike to build half a mile of trail on the north side near Joder Ranch. From December to May, we secured another machine to build an additional mile of trail. This machine work, paired with hand finishing, aimed to create a sustainable trail with minimal muddy closures. In total, BMA put in a significant amount of time and money into the project. If OSMP had contracted out the services that Mike provided, it would have been quite costly. For comparison, OSMP paid a substantial amount for a contractor to machine build a portion of the trail, but without the added hand finishing we provided. The exact statistics and financial details are in the email I sent you earlier today, but I can tell you that BMA's contributions were significant and valuable. The OSMP project lead for North Sky acknowledged that BMA's involvement not only provided essential help, but was also a value add to the project through Mike's design expertise. Looking ahead, we're excited to continue our collaboration with OSMP on projects like Greenbelt Plateau and Boulder Valley Ranch this summer. We'll be working to reroute and improve the 1 mile long Cobalt Trail to meet adaptive bike standards, making it accessible for more people. While we might get reimbursed for equipment rentals this year, Mike's expertise and dedication will once again be freely offered. I hope to see you all at the North Sky Grand Opening Ceremony in July. Thank you all for your time and continued support.
Thank you, Wendy. Before you step away, could I just ask a couple of clarifying questions?
Sure.
You referenced your email, and I'm trying to read both of them because I think that came later in the day. There's like the market value of the services or the market value of the support that you've offered, BMA has offered in the building of the North Sky Trail. And I think that's a number that you quote in here to be something like, do you remember? Can you read this?
Yeah, it's some line items, but I estimated with what the other contractor was paid, it was about $150,000 worth of time, equipment, and volunteer leading.
Okay.
And I believe City of Boulder says volunteer value is $31.51 per hour.
Yeah, that's actually a federal number.
There
And I
you
think
go.
it might be closer to 33, but yeah, that's a good. Thank you. Any other clarifying questions for Wendy? We're going to, I think, talk about this a little bit more in the next section. Thanks. Thank you, Wendy.
Okay. We do have someone who had their hand raised online who's now here in person. So next for this open comment section, we have Lynn Siegel, I believe is here. Oh, there we go.
Someone is Lynn Siegel. Where's Caroline Miller? She should be up there. I love seeing you live, remembering how she got thrown off the board for no good reason. This is very important because she was against CU South. And this is what I got thrown out of community cycles for the other night when they were talking about like bicycles off-road, like in the open space, which is a problem with these giant tires and the batteries and the risk of fire from the batteries. And I know Larry Gold's house up on the open space at Baseline and Flagstaff, he had his lawnmower plugged in. Fire burnt down the house, 15,000 square feet, $5 million it's selling for now, burnt down. So this is a lot of loss. And it's right near the house that's made of rock that Landmarks Board demoed on the open space there. No, 8,000 square feet, 6.1 million bucks. This is not the direction Boulder should be going. And that it was partially Chelsea Castellano's problem. We now need to get rid of someone, not Caroline Miller. We need to get rid of Chelsea Castellano off of the Landmarks Board, because guess what the Landmarks Board really is? The Landmarks Board is the demolition board. And I have supported houses not being demolished on the Landmarks Board, but most of them are a war crime, in my view. So, what do we need to talk about here? The City of Boulder's budget. Kind of tough times, isn't it? For buying open space, for maintaining open space. The corruption in the open space department is very deep and vast. And this needs to change. What we need to do is manage population, because the more we're building up more and more, 20 different multi-unit, 155 units at Hyundai place, you know, like all over town. You won't recognize it in a year. All these people require open space, especially when they're in 4-level buildings all over town, supported and subsidized by the developers in this town, right and left. Because you know me, Harmon, I've been following the planning board for a long time, and I see it happening, and it's not cool. This is not the Boulder that I want and that a lot of people want. And I hope that airport situation comes down crashing.
Thank you, Lynn. We appreciate
Done.
you.
I don't think you really do. I know you really don't.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else?
We have one more hand raised online. I do see it's a link. So if you could please identify yourself with your first and last name. I've allowed you to unmute yourself. So please go ahead and unmute yourself and then identify your first and last name.
Thank you. This is Linda Andes George. Sorry, I'm losing my voice this evening. I live at 8417 Stirrup Lane in Longmont. And good evening to the three of you who remain. I'm disappointed to see how few of you there are. For 7 years in the
There are
late
4 of
90s
us, by the way.
Oh, are there?
Yeah.
I only count three warm bodies.
I'm here. I'm lurking online, but thank you.
Oh, welcome back. So I have 3 items to present in my 3 minutes, and now it's 2.5. For 7 years in the late 90s and early 2000s, I used to sit where you're sitting now. And thank you for agreeing to spend these evenings, long evenings, with staff and the public. My first comment tonight concerns an aspect of the North Sky Trail process. I conduct a number of bird surveys on county open space, and I used to do sometimes these for the city as well as for mountain parks before your era. During one of these surveys, the 2023 Audubon Christmas bird count, I noticed that work on the North Sky Trail had begun, but it wasn't until early March 24 that this question came to my mind. And I wrote to you immediately and to staff folks, but I never received an answer. So here I am tonight to pose my question again. The last baseline surveys of natural resources in the foothills area through which the North Sky Trail will pass were conducted before 2015. That means that the data is already over a decade old. In my opinion, new baselines ought to have been conducted last year. In my March letter to you, I offered to help organize volunteers well known to staff to get this task done, even at that late date. I would like to ask you tonight, were there any avian, invertebrate, or botanical surveys done in the months preceding trail construction this year? And if so, where will we be able to access this data? I anticipate it will be needed in future management hearings. Question 2, this concerns the HCA ordinance. I was encouraged to see that this ordinance that you helped craft for the protection of the HCA surrounding the North Sky Trail is going to be with council very soon, and I commend you for that. Thank you. Point 3, actually, question. This is a deep concern for what may soon occur in the North Sky area. As you know, A major regional bike connection is being planned parallel to the highway, and we hit the headlines today. If this current planned connection is made, if the connections are made to the foothills trailheads like Lee Hill and Joder, the numbers of bikers will increase on the North Sky exponentially, and wildlife will definitely disappear, as will all the folks who love to practice what we like to call contemplative hiking, including geology and flower admirers. What practical plans are being discussed to
Thank you,
mitigate
Linda. We really
awful
appreciate
impact?
your public input.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I believe that at least for the first question that you had, you sent over email and Heather had a chance to respond to you. So perhaps it would be of value for the rest of the community if Heather, you could address her initial question about monitoring.
Is that on? Yes. The red light still messes me up. It's supposed to be green when it's on. Hi, Linda. Heather Swanson, Resource Stewardship Deputy Director. I did see your email to the board and spoke some with staff about what we've been doing over the last several years. The inventory report, you're right, in 2015 did summarize the baseline data that we had prior to the North TSA. But we have continued surveys in the area for a variety of natural resources. And just for the interest of time, I'll just read a list of those. And if you have more questions about details on them, either you and I can interact directly, or maybe later in the meeting, if there's time for that, we could certainly talk more about that in questions around the North Sky Trail. So we, on an annual basis, do songbird surveys in the area. We have grassland plant community survey transects, which are monitored every 3 years. They were most recently done in 2023. There have been Bell's twin pod rare plant surveys done, including ongoing monitoring during the trail construction to ensure that those individuals are avoided during the design and construction of the trail, and those were done most recently this year. We have done comprehensive vegetation mapping as recently as 2023. We mapped shrubs and drainages as related to Preble's meadow jumping mouse habitat in 2022. We did wetland assessment and mapping in 2023, surveys for Preble's meadow jumping mouse in the foothills drainages in 2022. We complete annual prairie dog mapping. The last was done in the fall of 2023. We monitor the golden eagle nest in the left-hand palisades, which is not directly adjacent to the North Sky Trail, but is within the North Foothills HCA area. We also installed a trail camera to monitor wildlife along the new trail alignment in 2021. We take opportunistic butterfly observations when staff are out there, which happens each year. And finally, weed surveys are done as part of treatment for a variety of priority species that takes place every year in the area. We also did some seed collections over the last many years to stockpile native seed to be used in restoration after the trail construction and in restoration of social trails. And we did salvage of the couple of individual Bell's twin pods that could not be avoided by the trail design, and salvaged other native plants for use in other native plantings and restoration projects before the trail construction began.
Thank you, Heather. I really appreciate that.
Heather, thanks. And I just have a really quick comment for Linda. Linda, thank you for your testimony, even though you didn't quite get through it all. I want to assure you that we got your email and when we have received it and read it.
Video would be great.
Sam, are there any other members of the community?
No other hands.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we're going to turn our attention to matters from the board. This is a time in which we can talk about items that were provided as written information to the board. And that way we can capitalize on staff if they're present here earlier on in the meeting. So I'm going to start with the first item. Do we have questions, comments about the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, the Open Space and Mountain Parks Disaster Response Team? No? Okay, seeing none. How about the Fort Chambers Poor Farm Site Management Plan update? right. Thanks for all that information on those two very well-written memos.
Can I just say something?
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I don't have any questions about the Four Chambers Poor Farm site, but I really appreciate you keeping us up to speed on that. It's one of the most exciting projects that OSMP is doing right now, and I love being part of it. Thank you.
Yeah, and we'll be back next month to present you with the final concept plan.
Okay, so the other item, the third item that was provided as written information is the North Sky Trail completion memo. And I understand, well, Wendy spoke about that earlier. I just would like to open the floor for any comments or questions from my fellow trustees about that project. We are scheduled to have a grand opening, I think, on July 20, a grand opening ceremony on July 22nd. I just want to, just comment on like what an amazing project this has been. It's been something that's been in the works for a very long time, and we got a chance to do a field trip out there several months ago and see the work that has been done and see the trail workers and also the volunteers. I understand that there were volunteers and BMA out there even today with people, and people have really like literally stuck their hands in the dirt to get this done. And it's amazing to see, and I'm super excited to be able to check it out really soon.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thing from a staff perspective, it didn't get included into the memo, but a very recent activity. Just want to let you know that we're doing some restoration of the riparian habitat at the Schneider Jaw site where the one of the bridges has been placed. And that restoration is underway and will be completed in early July. The project includes installation of rock structures in the stream channel to create natural pools and riffles in areas that have impacted by severe flooding. And the improved stream channel will better support riparian shrub habitat along Schneider Jaw. So if you've been following this project, one of our goals, along with the trail construction, was to do habitat restoration and opportunities throughout it. And so right now we're working in the Schneider Jaw area. So just wanted to call your attention to that.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on to.
Hey, Michelle.
Oh,
I
sure.
had my hand up. Just a few quick comments. One, I want to thank BMA for their Subsky Trail. This is I've talked about this at almost every meeting. I'm incredibly enthusiastic about this trail. Been excited about it since it was first conceived. And yeah, so kudos again to the staff, BMA, for your help. And we did get a few comments like tonight, and then also in the email, concerns about it being used heavily by bicycles and potentially being difficult for pedestrians to use. And Dan, I wonder if you have any comments to offer on that, or anyone on the staff, in terms of to address those concerns.
Well, I would say that it's hard to predict how the trail will be used, who will be using it. But as a staff, in fact, just next week, we have another meeting of various staffs from various principals within the organization that's going to be discussing the opening, what the first 90 days looks like from a staff perspective, how we want to go out and, establish some messaging, establish a culture out there of multi-use and considerate use, emphasize education around sort of, I wouldn't call them unique rules, because Boulder's full of unique rules across our system. But as you know, there's some very specific rules that go along with these trails. So we want to have the opportunity to have greater staff presence from our outreach staff and our ranger staff out there sort of talking to the trail users. And we also will be continuing our monitor. We have some trail counters out there, so we'll be collecting some information to give us a better sense of how the trail is used, who uses it, what type of conflict we may be seeing, so we can do some adaptive management in the future. So yeah, we're excited. As a staff, we're getting ready for the opening and ready to have some enhanced presence out there and do some messaging and have some interactions with the users.
That sounds great, Dan. And I think I would just say to the public, those who've expressed concern is let's do what Dan said. Let's wait and see who shows up, how it gets used, and if there are concerns in the future based on actual real data on the ground, then we can address those at a future time. And I'm committed to hearing from the public if there are concerns once the trail's open. So again, thanks to all the staff, and I'll be at the opening. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. Okay, so the next item is about management area designations, and I'm going to turn this over to Dan here for a staff presentation. Just from a process standpoint, trustees can then ask clarifying questions, and then I will open up the public hearing. Does that sound right? Did I get that order right? Okay. Then we can deliberate and ask additional questions, and ultimately we are being asked to make a motion on the issue.
That's correct. And we have Casey French, our planning senior manager, as well as Juliet Benell, our OSMP planner, who is going to be leading our discussion on this. And this should be somewhat familiar to you by now because this is groups 2 and 3, meaning that we already brought group 1 to you before, I believe, earlier this year or late last year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Casey.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm here with Juliet again, and we're just going to talk about assigning management area designations to properties currently without them. And I'm going to kick off our presentation with just a very brief refresher of management area designations, since I know most of you have learned about them during our previous board touches. And then Juliet will cover the specific management area designation recommendations for properties. So the Visitor Master Plan first established our MADs in 2005, and it established 4 designations and the landscape approach for applying them. And the goal of MADs is to provide the context and the guidance on the management emphasis for an area. So I'm not going to delve into the criteria and characteristics of each designation because I've done that in the past. But I did just want to note that all of OSMP's charter purposes can occur across the management area designations. So, for example, recreation and agriculture, those do occur in all of our management area designations. Again, the focus is on the management emphasis. And in terms of where MADs fit into our plans, they provide broad system-wide and overarching guidance. The VMP is a system-wide plan that, along with others, are used to inform and support specific site planning efforts and operational management. So last year, we identified about 40 properties that didn't have management area designations, and this project is focused on integrating those into the context. And so to do this, we looked primarily at the landscape context, meaning the adjacent management area designations, and also the criteria and characteristics of our management area designations. So in addition to assigning management area designations, we did also take a look at the open and closed status. So as a reminder, upon acquisition, properties are immediately closed. Then soon after, we do an assessment to identify any immediate or short-term actions to integrate the property into our management. And at that time, if the property can be opened with minimal risk to sensitive resources, that's what we do. Otherwise, the property remains closed. So going into this project, we do have a mix of open and closed properties, and we did reevaluate again to see if any of them could be opened. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Juliet to go through the properties in this group.
Thanks, Casey, and good evening. So for this project, we divided the 40 properties into 4 groups. And last December, you shared your recommendation feedback on our recommendations for the Group 1 properties. So tonight, I'm going to be sharing our recommendations for the 2nd and 3rd group of properties. In total, we're recommending 4 properties or portions of to be designated as HCA. So sorry. So 4 properties or portions of to be designated as HCA, 5 properties as passive recreation areas, 4 properties as natural areas, and 2 properties or portions of to be designated as agricultural areas. And to break it down by group, we're recommending 2 properties be designated as HCA, 5 properties as passive recreation areas, and 2 properties as natural areas. All of these properties are small, so we're really using the landscape context to inform these recommendations and integrate them into our system. And all of these properties are recommended to be open. So specific information about each of them is included in your memo, so I won't go over that in detail, but if you have any questions about specific properties within this group, I'm happy to share more information. Within Group 3, we're recommending 2 properties or portions of be designated as HCA, 2 properties or portions of be designated as agricultural area, and 2 properties as natural areas. Historic agricultural use has created more variability of resources from property to property or within properties in this area of our system. And because of this, interspersed agriculture, MADs in this eastern part of the system have slightly more of a patchwork nature than the rest of our system. And so landscape context does apply here too. And because of these nuances, I'm going to share some more details about our recommendations for the properties within this group. For Weiser, we're recommending an HCA designation and that it be added to the adjacent Lower Boulder Creek HCA, since this was originally the intent when this property was acquired. Weiser has similar high natural resource values as the adjacent HCA and is in alignment with the VMP criteria for HCA. It includes geographically unique topography and a combination of different habitats that support diverse suite of wildlife and plant communities, some of which are rare and protected species. Weiser is currently closed, along with other adjacent and nearby properties that are part of the Lower Boulder Creek HCA. And so for consistency with this management of the HCA and continued protection of resources, we're recommending that Weiser continue to be closed. The portion of the Boulder Valley Farm property along the Boulder Creek corridor, including multiple ponds, is recommended to be designated as HCA, while the remaining portions of it are recommended to be designated as agricultural area. The Boulder Creek corridor portion of the property has similar high natural resource values as the adjacent HCA and is in alignment with VMP HCA criteria. And that's because this is a large habitat block, a high biodiversity area, and important wildlife corridor used by many species of birds, species like bald eagles, ospreys, and great blue herons. And this portion of the property also includes 8 ponds from historic gravel mining and a small segment of the Lower Boulder Ditch. The other portion of Boulder Valley Farm to the north and south of the creek corridor is being recommended as agricultural area. And this portion of the property includes designated farmland of national importance. It's currently leased irrigated hay and grass pasture, irrigated alfalfa and dryland pasture. All of these values are in alignment with VMP criteria for agricultural area. It also includes a 16-acre ranch headquarters compound, agricultural infrastructure like barns, corrals, horse sheds. And this portion of Boulder Valley Farm is eligible for local landmark status with buildings and structures of historic and architectural significance. Boulder Valley Farm is currently closed and recommended to remain closed, though access is being considered and evaluated as part of the Boulder to Erie Regional Trail process and a potential future planning process. Martinson is recommended to be designated as agricultural area. It's adjacent to other OSMP properties that are agricultural areas and was purchased with the intent of managing it for these purposes. This property is irrigated and used for grazing and hay, which is consistent with VMP criteria for agricultural area. It's currently closed, but many of the surrounding properties are open, so therefore we're recommending that it be opened. And Woodley is recommended to be designated natural area. Though it's adjacent to properties that are agricultural areas, you can see that it's also nearby a patchwork of properties that are natural areas. And the intent when purchasing this property was to preserve the portion of the Dry Creek riparian corridor and wetlands that are on the property. It also includes the Dry Creek Davidson Ditch and 2 ponds, all of which are high natural resource values and align at best with the VMP criteria for natural area. It is currently closed, but again, many of the surrounding properties are open, so therefore we're recommending it be opened. And then Rosenblatt Ryan is also recommended to be designated as natural area. Like Woodley, it's adjacent to OSMP properties designated as agricultural areas, but it's also in that same vicinity nearby that patchwork of natural areas. Rosenblatt Ryan includes high value resources across the board. So in other words, high natural, agricultural, and recreational values. And that best aligns it with the VMP criteria for natural area. The property's natural values include 2 spring-fed ponds, riparian areas along and including Dry Creek and the Dry Creek-Davidson Ditch that support a diverse suite of habitat and species. The property's agricultural values include suitability for irrigated and dryland crops and a current lease for grazing and hay production. And for recreational value, it has the potential to provide a link for a conceptual trail alignment to connect the city's Bobolink trailhead with the Teller Farm space, open space property included on the BVCP Trails map. The property is currently closed, but again, many of the surrounding OSMP properties with similar values are open, so we're recommending that this be opened as well. So that's our presentation, and we're happy to answer any clarifying questions. The recommendations that we're proposing you make to City Council are on the slide for your reference, and as is the feedback that we're hoping to hear from you on the open and closed status of properties and non-HCA MAD recommendations that don't require council approval.
Thank you, Juliet and Casey. This is an opportunity to ask for clarifying questions. I can't see Brady now, but I don't know if who would like to ask any clarifying questions.
I've got a question. So thanks for the presentation. For Boulder Valley Farm, you mentioned that it's closed. There's potential that it could be open pending the Boulder Erie Regional Trail. And so I'm just wondering if our decision to designate that portion as a habitat conservation area, if that's a little bit, should we wait until we have clarity on the BERT before doing this designation? Is there a possibility that this will somehow complicate our ability to complete that trail connector?
HCA status shouldn't influence. There's not really going to be any impact from the recommendation because there's nothing in HCA status versus our other management area designation status that would preclude a trail. So there, as Casey kind of introduced in the beginning background information, there's nothing precludes a trail in any of our HCAs.
And I also just might add that the BERT goes through a larger part of the HCA. So that corridor is not just particular to that property. So I guess, we're looking at, when we're looking at that HCA, we're really looking at that HCA as a whole and what those values are and assigning a management area designation to those values. So those values kind of extend or being filled in to that existing HCA. And as Juliet said, it doesn't preclude trail development.
So the surrounding HCA there that already exists, that portion, that the 1.3 miles or acres of that you're recommending becomes an HCA now, that is roughly where we anticipate the alignment the BERT alignment to be rather than, of course, on the ag side of it.
So as part of the BERT master planning process, several different alignments were thoroughly vetted and evaluated, and that is one of the alignments that has been explored.
It's one that's a candidate.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you think that's a likely candidate?
Boulder County has not made their recommendation yet.
Other questions about any of the staff presentation?
Do we have examples of HCAs that have been designated where we built trails on them after they were designated as an HCA?
I think it
North
was,
Sky Trail.
yeah. Yeah, and then, because the VMP, I was going to say, I think it was also High Plains in the Marshall Mesa area was designated after that HCA was designated in the VMP also.
Yeah, what portion of the North Sky was HCA before? I know we had to get an easement. Was the whole thing? It wasn't the whole thing, was it?
Well, except for the part, the ownership of Beach, the entire thing was, yes, HCA.
Other than where we went through beach and through the old chain link fence, everything was HCA.
Correct.
And it remained HCA. Got it.
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, under the designation. Now it will be under ordinance next Thursday night with council. But yeah.
Is there a reason to, in terms, and I just got to understand the sequence here. Is there a reason to not look at this holistically with the BERT process versus like going, I know you mentioned that we could designate the HCA now. This is more of a process question. And then we do site planning after that. And then that would bring us to a point in time where they might have made up their mind on where the alignment of the BERT would happen, and what sort of conversations would have to happen if it's already designated an HCA, and the folks wanting to put the BERT right there.
I don't think it would influence, or HCA designation would influence the conversation about any impacts, values, and benefits of one alignment over the other. I think that even if that was the preferred BERT alignment and we came back to this, just because there was a trail there wouldn't influence our decision not to designate this portion of the South Boulder Creek with the ponds and the wetland habitat as HCA, because they're extensions of the values of the other portion of the HCA. So even if we did it later, our recommendation would likely be HCA. It wouldn't influence because it's based on the natural values. So it wouldn't influence our staff recommendation, even if that was the potential BERT alignment.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so so even natural areas can be open for public access. So is it really the open versus closed status that would be determinative about whether we would recommend having a trail go through a property than which one of the four MAD designations the property is given?
Correct, and we could even keep the rest of the property, closed and just have the portion of the trail open. Part of the reason that we closed the property was just to maybe for a future site planning process. And I don't want to confuse the two, like the BERT could be one process. That's one process that's affecting this property, but this is a rather large property. And we've considered potentially doing a larger, more holistic site planning process for this whole property in the future. And management area designations are really intended to kind of influence and provide some general guidance to that process. So that's generally why we do them before.
Thank you.
Okay, we can return in more detail after public input, but I do have a couple of other questions. Why do you want to keep the Boulder Valley Farm, the piece that you're recommending as ag, closed? And do you see that as, I know you got to do site planning, but do you see that as the future state forever?
There are some concerns with the level of agricultural use and it being open because there's a very busy agricultural, center with lots of grazing, that there are complexities associated with that. And it's such a heavy use on that particular area of the property that at least until site planning, until we have more of that opportunity to look in finer scale detail at what may or may work, we want to leave the entirety of the property closed until we look in that finer scale.
And then I have another question regarding Boulder Falls. I just kind of want to, it's been a long time since I've been out there, so I wanted to clarify just sort of the facts there. So you're proposing that that be a natural area, and it currently has that one trail that everybody uses to go look at the falls, right? And then there's a designated trail, okay, and then there's a climbing access trail, right? And that takes you to that keyhole feature in the rock. I haven't been there in years again. And then it says, while the remainder of the property remains closed due to safety concerns for resource protection. Is the area beyond that keyhole open, or is it closed? Technically, officially. I know the signs might say something else.
To the best of my knowledge, that area is closed as well. The only areas that are open is the designated access trail to the falls and that climbing access trail. And then outside of that, the remainder of the property is closed to access.
So does that wall, that climbing wall called Plotinus Wall, are you saying that that's closed as well?
I don't know if I'm clear on exactly what portion you're asking about.
Yeah, so that
Any
climbing,
weekend, it's where all the climbers are. If that's what we're asking. Are all the climbers on a closed piece of property or not?
I think it's on the adjacent property.
Yeah, I think that area is not closed, the climbing area. I believe it's the adjacent area.
Well, that's good news. Thank you.
so there's an open climbing access trail which brings you to an area that people are climbing, which is also open. Okay, so it's not this area, the balance that says that it's closed. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify that. Any other clarifying questions around management area designations? Okay, so no other clarifying questions. We can go ahead and open up public testimony on this item.
Yes, so if you'd like to speak online, it's, please do raise your hand. We did have one person signed up in advance, but they are not currently here in person or online. And then we don't have anyone signed up to speak in person. So if you'd like to speak online, just a reminder to please raise your hand. Okay, we don't have any hands for this one.
Okay. All right, so public testimony is now closed. Thank you. Okay, so this is our opportunity to deliberate and ask additional questions. I guess for me, I don't know if you look at my notes, I do always struggle when we have to look at these maps with color coding. And so it took me a little while to kind of figure out what's what, and not just this particular memo, but also the bike rack one. Looking at you, Jeff. So I know he's shaking his head. But yeah, so it took me a little while to get my head wrapped around all of these different areas, but also trying to just understand the sequencing. I know what you're saying, Casey, but that you can have an HCA and you can do all of these other things that are approved under the open space charter. I also saw a lot of emails recently and talking about the HCA that's over there by North Sky, and that was, an eyes wide open issue that was debated by a lot of community members about the alignment of the North Sky Trail in the HCA, and just got a lot of reading all those emails and people saying, well, this is an HCA ordinance, and there's we really didn't account for this level of bike traffic, and some people wanted to make that connection with the bikeway and the North Sky Trail, and that, I guess, that's another topic here. It's those are different people, I think, who use the bikeway. It's a road. There are road bikers who would use the bikeway versus other people, like perhaps on gravel bikes or mountain bikes, who would use the North Sky. And there are some concerns about like it becoming a speed loop or something like that. And so I think with people talking about the HCAs and bikes, I am concerned that people are going to continue to use the fact that this particular segment being designated as an HCA as a reason to not do the Boulder Erie Regional Trail. And my main concern is is looking at this holistically rather than very narrowly. I guess I want to understand from a timing perspective, since it's closed anyway, is there any sense for why we need to do this now versus do this later when we're going through the process, while we're going through the process of aligning the BERT? Is there
Well-
some sort of time sensitivity?
I mean, there is no sense of time sensitivity. There is a feeling amongst staff that these designations, going back in time, ideally would have been done at the time of acquisition. It is not precluding future planning efforts, which may actually suggest a different designation at a different time at a site planning process. That would be a time to revisit a MAD. So our sense of timing on this is that the VMP calls for us to apply this. We went through several years of accumulating a number of properties that didn't. So we have a patchwork across the system of some designations and some without it. And so this is an attempt to have a system-wide approach to where every property has a designation. I personally feel like our staff has applied the correct designation based on the definitions to each. Specific site planning will go into play then to determine a number of different things, such as public use. It could even open up the question of, should it be a different designation again? There's nothing that would preclude that. And so, no, there is no time sensitivity to it, but I would agree with Casey that in regarding what we're suggesting for HCA over Boulder Valley Farm, that from a staff perspective, we would be unlikely to come to a different conclusion, whether there's the BERT trail or not the BERT trail. Simply looking at the landscape level out there, what's out there, what are the resources, and what criteria best matches to the VMP definition and the context setting. So the answer, long-winded way of saying no, there is no time sensitivity, but I would say that taking that approach has led to the fact that we've accumulated over 40 properties that don't have a designation.
Dan,
Go ahead. Is it okay for me to talk?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, actually, just let me ask a clarifying question of a comment that Dan made first. Dan, you said that a designation could be changed in the site planning process. Has that ever actually happened? And in particular, has an HCA ever been changed to something other than an HCA?
Not in my tenure here at OSMP. That's, I don't know if there's any staff that could go back further. Heather's shaking her head.
So while it's a possibility, it's also probably not probable.
I did follow up that from a staff perspective of reading our guidance and our plan guidance and applying the designation to what our plan is saying meets that criteria, that regardless of a trail or no trail there, that I wouldn't see from a staff perspective that we would be changing our opinion on this particular property based on what's out there from a resource standpoint. But no, it wouldn't preclude it. If we were doing a site planning process and we overwhelmingly heard that sentiment from the board and the community, we could certainly, we would take a fresh look at that. But I guess it hasn't been done, to your direct question.
Michelle, if I may, so I think I just want to reiterate one thing that Michelle said. I remember the North TSA process and the North Sky Trail was very divisive. Some of us may not remember that anymore, but it was, and a lot of it did revolve around the fact that it was an HCA. That HCA, I understand from a letter of the law perspective, HCAs don't preclude trails, but there was an argument within our community at that time that HCAs are sacrosanct. And that aligning the North Sky Trail on the west side of the road versus the east side of the road was was a travesty in some people's mind. And so I think those of us who remember that are maybe a little bit cautious about HCA designations in places where we might anticipate future regional connector trails, given that history. And I understand, and your point's well made, Dan, that you've got a lot of properties that you felt could have been designated at acquisition, and you're trying to clean things up and probably don't want to delay things. So I guess what I'm saying is I can see both perspectives.
I'll just remind that despite the HC designation and the loud voices we heard on both sides, a trail ended up being recommended. And I think, and then some nuanced regulations went into play to hopefully balance the protection aspects that we heard from aspects of the community that felt perhaps a trail wasn't warranted. So yes, HCA, but a trail ultimately approved for the area. And yeah, I'll stop there. I don't see the fact that there might be a strong views on one way or the other is not necessarily a bad thing. And it's still up to staff to apply the plan guidance that's in the VMP and the definitions and try to do that as consistently as we can. And so I couldn't see a staff perspective looking at the resources out at the riparian corridor, at Boulder Valley Farm, or the HCA in place for North Foothills, and looking at that definition and coming in with a definition of passive recreation, for instance, because in our minds, we think we got it right with the designation that's out there. And we also have a trail now out there.
I did have just one clarification, if I may. If that alignment was chosen for BERT, I just want to clarify that it will go through the existing properties designated as HCA. So it is going through that HCA, and we're just infilling. So I just wanted to just make that clarification.
Sorry, Casey, I'm really having a hard time hearing because of the fan, but I know it's like bloody hot in here.
Right.
But I have hearing issues, so I have a hard time filtering out additional noise and trying to hear the noises that I want to hear. But what were you trying to say? You're saying that... Yeah.
I'm saying that if that were to be the alignment selected for BERT, that the existing HCA, there are other properties designated as that HCA, the whole South Boulder Creek, Lower Boulder Creek HCA already exists, and BERT does go through properties already designated.
I see, because
That's
existing,
yes.
not just this particular parcel.
Exactly. I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
So I think you're saying it might, go through the properties, but the HCA's between Weiser and Boulder Valley Farm.
Correct.
Is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. So it would kind of like go like this, and this is already an HCA in the proposed alignment.
And then this portion of where's the HCA?
So this is the new HCA, and this is existing HCA.
So I've put up on the screen again. So basically, this is the existing Lower Boulder Creek HCA in green here. We've got Boulder Valley Farm here, Weiser. And so the rail corridor being explored is through here. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you hear that?
Oh,
Oh, good.
oh, fun.
Sorry. So you're saying it would go through the new HCA. We're talking about designating, right? But it would also go through that HCA to the west there that's an existing HCA.
Correct.
That's very helpful context. Thank you. Other questions or comments? How are people feeling about moving this along? One disadvantage to this is I have to hear my voice more. It's not good.
Yeah, so I guess when you look at the characteristics of the four different MADs, there's one that really promotes trails. It's passive recreation. but natural area, HCA, and ag especially, ag does not want us to put trails on the properties. If you look at the characteristics, the way that they've been presented to us. So I think that for me, the hurdle is just that there's language in the characteristics for HCA's that talks about not preferring trails. It doesn't say trails are not supposed to exist on an HCA. It just specifies a lower level of visitor use with no or few trails and trailheads. So I think that may be where people are getting the impression that HCA's could be a cudgel that would be used to, beat off the trail people and keep these places, left alone. But for me, I'm more satisfied with staff's explanation that it's a closure that's really the determinative factor, and that if there's a valuable trail resource or a network connection that needs to be made through an HCA, it can get done. There's nothing really preclusive in the characteristics of an HCA. I think that what staff's trying to do is put a management area designation on every piece of property that the system has, so that we know how to treat it. And their professional judgment is that, this one's an HCA. It looks more, it walks more. If it's a duck, it quacks, right? And this isn't for passive recreation. This riparian area is not ag. It's an HCA. It's for habitat conservation, and it's not necessarily a natural area. So, I think it's important that we get it on the record that there's nothing about this designation that should be preclusive of a valuable trail being put through it. But I'm not feeling too frightened about the HCA status or designation.
Thank you. John, do you have any input on this?
Knowing after looking at the map and hearing the explanation, I had a bit of concern coming into it, but I feel a lot more comfortable with it after talking through it with staff, and would be comfortable designating it as an HCA.
So the only thing preventing it at this from being opened is doing a site planning process, right? So we would do the site planning process before we would actually be able to allow the county to, Casey, tell me how that would, what the timeline is.
Yeah, we could if that were this, there's a whole bunch of ifs, but if that were the selected alignment, we're probably years out for construction for that. But let's say that came before our site planning. There are other mechanisms in our tools, such as open enclosures, that we could allow if that trail were constructed prior to when we prioritize the site planning for the whole, we could open that portion of the property through regulatory means and have that trail go through. If the site planning process were to occur before then that would be the timeline. So those two timelines are in flux, so it's hard to know which would occur, but we could, if that were the alignment and if it were constructed, we have other means to open that portion of the property for the trail.
And I would just add that the alignment under evaluation that goes through the HCA technically is on RTD right-of-way. So it is adjacent, it goes through our HCA, but it's RTD right-of-way.
Very helpful, thank you. Anything else from you, Brady, on this? I'm feeling a lot better about it, so thank you for taking the time to walk us through that.
Yeah. And I'll just note that I don't think no one here was on board when we purchased Boulder Valley Farm in the late teens. If anybody is interested in going out there, it's a wonderful site. Introduce you to our agricultural tenant. The 16-acre farmstead with the buildings is quite impressive from an historical perspective. I'd be happy to escort anyone out there that is interested in learning more about the site. So I'll just say that.
Thank you. Might take you up on that. So, I mean, all the rest of the proposals made sense for me, to me. So that was just the, the two main areas that I had questions on. So if we don't have any additional questions, concerns, would anybody like to put forth a motion? Staff has provided one for us.
If you've got it in front of you, you have to do it. You don't need to. I'll motion that one, we recommend that the Boulder City Council approve inclusion of the 90 and 96 Arapahoe properties as part of the Western Mountain Parks Habitat Conservation Area. And two, recommend that the Boulder City Council approve inclusion of the Weiser property and the portion of the Boulder Valley Farm property along the Boulder Creek corridor as shown in attachment F as part of the Lower Boulder Creek Habitat Conservation Area.
Just have a little discussion, or second, I guess, first. I'll second it, then can we talk about it
Yeah,
for a second?
okay, go ahead.
So I second. And it really just, I don't fully understand why the motion is only for these two properties, and then we're just helping out with recommendations on the other 38 properties. Maybe I missed that, but can staff just address that real quick before we vote?
Sure. So HCA's have a specific, that you need a recommendation to council, and then there's an ordinance. They have closures, they have special regulations associated with them, so they have some ordinances. So the rest of them don't have special ordinances, so you don't require a recommendation to council.
But weren't there other sites among the 40 that were recommended to be HCA's that
Oh.
we're not having a vote on specifically in this
So we
motion?
had you vote on the first group of HCA's in the first group, and then we're having you make a recommendation on the HCA's in these. And then if there are any in the fourth group, you'll make a motion on that, and then we'll package those all together and bring it to council as one.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a second and no other clarifying questions. I can't see, oh, I see Brady over there. Okay, so I guess I'll do a roll call. Trustee Carroll,
Yes.
Trustee Robinson,
Yes.
and Trustee Zuckerman.
Yes.
And I also vote yes. Passes unanimously. Okay, let's move on to the next item. Are we good? Yeah, okay. Casey, you don't want to leave? Juliet, you don't want to leave? You can stay. I don't know if Bethany
No,
wants
we're
to
gonna
get up
mix
there
it
or
up.
not.
We got a good mix of stuff today, so we're gonna go from planning to real estate. And our next public hearing item is regarding a very small utility easement request, and I'm going to invite Mark Petrucci to come up. Oh, and Bethany's going to join us up here. Okay. To quickly run you through, just as an FYI, this is, we wrestled with whether this is the first poster child for the idea of a consent agenda item, but because it does require a disposal decision, we did squeeze it down from the allotted time, so we'll provide a very brief presentation on this underground gas line request. And with that, I think I'm turning things over to Mark right away.
I believe so.
Yeah. And just so you know, this is Mark's relatively new to the staff as one of our property agents. And I think this is his inaugural presentation to OSBT. So with that, we like to treat him gently and kind.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Good evening, trustees. My name is Mark Pedrucci, and I'm a senior property agent with the Real Estate Services for OSMP. We're here tonight to talk about a request from Xcel Energy to install and maintain a buried natural gas pipeline within a portion of the William Arnold open space. So we'll go over this brief presentation, and then I'll try to answer any questions you may have. Next slide. So this is a vicinity map just to kind of get you oriented to the site, just showing the general location of the gas line corridor and the permanent utility easement request. The area is north of Arapahoe Avenue and to the east of Foothills Parkway. It's very close and just north of the Boulder Community Hospital, and it's right along the Boulder Creek path. Next slide. So I'll just give a very brief project overview. Xcel Energy has determined that they need to replace an 8-inch natural gas pipeline that has become exposed within Boulder Creek, and it's shown in the photo on this slide. The existing pipeline is located within Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad right-of-way, and due to spacing requirements, the new pipeline cannot be located in that BNSF right-of-way. And that is why Xcel has approached us to ask for this permanent utility easement from the city. Construction will be done via directional boring. It'll be 30 to 50 feet deep below grade. And with that, there will be no surface impacts to the open space. The size of this requested utility easement is about 1/10 of an acre. Next slide. Here's a property map that shows a little more detail of the area in question. So the gas line, the entire gas line corridor where the new pipeline will go in is shown as the yellow polygon. And the permanent utility easement request on the William Arnold open space is shown with a little bit of red cross hatching. The entry and exit boreholes will be within adjacent private property in that Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad right-of-way at either end of this long gas line corridor. Next slide. So benefits to OSMP and to the public for the gas line replacement by Xcel Energy include elimination of a safety and environmental hazard with that exposed gas pipeline. Xcel Energy will bear all costs for the gas line replacement. The city will be compensated for granting the permanent easement in the amount of $2,091. Those funds would go towards future acquisition and stewardship needs for the system. And then lastly, the permanent utility easement, it gives Xcel Energy the rights that they need to operate and maintain, the natural gas service line in this area. Next slide. So in closing, as Dan mentioned, this does qualify as a disposal process. So interest in open space land, including utility easements like this, may be conveyed as long as they comply with the disposal provisions of Article 12, Section 177 of the Boulder City Charter, which does require Open Space Board of Trustees approval and a recommendation to City Council for their approval. In this slide, the photo shows the actual area where the utility, or part of the area where the utility easement is being requested. The arrow on the left side is pointing to a small marker, and that's basically an above ground marker showing where the existing gas line is right now. And that, again, that's in Burlington Northern Santa Fe right of way. And then essentially they're trying to move it just a little bit in this photo, just to the right in about the center of the slide. And then last slide. And so with that, staff is recommending to the Board of Trustees for approval of the granting of this about 1/10 of an acre permanent utility easement to Xcel Energy. Thank you for considering this request, and let me know if you have any questions.
Go ahead, Harmon.
Yeah, mostly just out of curiosity. 30 to 50 feet deep, is that something normal these days, that gas pipelines go that far below the surface?
When they have to bore below the creek, they
Yeah.
are required to go that deep. Yeah. In the rest of the corridor, it would be allowed to come up to about the 30-foot area, but they are buried quite deep anymore,
Okay.
so that other utilities really can exist on top of them.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for that, and welcome to the very warm council chambers, Mark.
Thank you.
Sometimes I have to wear a beanie and a down jacket, and you got to dress in layers in this room.
We hope the warmth of the room is only exceeded by the warmth of our welcome.
He's having a heat stroke.
So no clarifying questions other than that. So let's open up for public testimony.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. We do have one person signed up in advance, but I'm not seeing them in person or online right now. Just a reminder, if you are joining online, to please raise your hand. Okay. Not seeing any hands, and we don't have anyone signed up in person.
Okay, thank you. So I'll go ahead and close public testimony and entertain a motion.
Sure.
Oh, no, I think.
I move to approve and recommend that City Council approve the conveyance of a permanent utility easement of approximately 0.1 acres to Public Service Company of Colorado, DBA Excel Energy, to install and maintain a buried natural gas line within the City of Boulder's William Arnold open space property pursuant to the disposal procedures of Article 12, Section 177 of the City of Boulder Charter.
I'll second.
Do we want to have, so do we want to have any deliberation on this? If not, I'll do a roll call. Trustee Carroll,
Yes.
Trustee Robinson,
Yes.
and Trustee Zuckerman.
Yes.
And I also vote yes. It passes unanimously. I can't say that word tonight.
See, Mark, how easy that is? We'll give you the hard one next time. All right, continuing our roller coaster. We're going to go back to North Foothills for a little bit here tonight. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Highway 36 bikeway and where that process is at. And it is reaching a little bit of a different phase coming up. And so we wanted to provide a touchdown space with and get the sense of where the trustees are at this point before the project moves into a different and more detailed phase. So to walk us through that is Marnie Ratzel, OSMP Principal Planner, and I think Casey will support anything else from the audience, so if need be. So turn things over to Marnie.
Now is it on?
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Give me a minute while I get set up here. Okay. One more thing on my screen, I'll be ready. Okay. Good evening. As Dan said, I'm Marnie Ratzel. I'm a principal planner with the Planning and Design Services team. And I'm here to provide an update on the feasibility study that's underway to consider a bikeway adjacent to the North Foothills Highway, which we also call US 36. It's a little confusing because the US 36 is what people think between Boulder and Denver. So wanted to make sure to get that terminology set with you guys. It is connecting from Boulder up to Lyons. Tonight, the department, OSMP, is requesting board consideration of a motion to support the bikeway and encourage OSMP's continued participation for the bikeway project as it proceeds to the next phases of evaluation and design. So OSMP has expressed support for the feasibility study because the bikeway could provide a new connection for cyclists to get to OSMP trails in the north area, as well as serve the needs of recreational cyclists for a regional trail between Boulder and Lyons. And it also offers a direct connection along US 36 that would complement our trail system and better accommodate cyclists that are really seeking a remote recreational ride on open space land. So we think it would complement the upcoming North Sky Trail. There's a lot of road cyclists that are currently riding on the shoulder, and I think they would continue to use the 36 corridor. OSMP owns or has conservation easements on lands adjacent to US 36. And an objective is to avoid encroachment into OSMP lands as much as possible, as well as minimize and mitigate any impacts to open space values and lands if open space lands are needed. The Boulder to Lyons section of US 36 is a really popular cycling route with many cyclists already riding on the shoulder of US 36. Cyclists ride the route for recreation. There's a lot of elite trainers that ride the route, and there are people who commute to and from work. The current data from CDOT, as well as the community input that was received during the feasibility study, indicates that there are many more cyclists who would consider themselves in what's called the interested but concerned category. They don't feel safe riding the shoulder, but they would ride the route if there was a separated path. US 36 also has had more crashes into cyclists by motorists than any other road in the county. And when I say US 36, I am referring to from J Road up to Highway 66. Due to these unsafe conditions, the high number of cyclists, the bikeway is a high priority for Boulder County transportation. In terms of design considerations to guide the development of a conceptual alignment, a primary objective is to contain the bikeway within CDOT right-of-way as much as possible. The bikeway will be hard surfaced. It'll be maintained to a transportation standard and meet design guidelines for bikeways. Additionally, a desire is to maximize the separation of the bikeway from the roadway travel lanes. I'm going to show you what that looks like. Whoops. After my next slide, I will. So the feasibility study is the first phase and has focused on confirming the highway right-of-way that's owned by CDOT. It's a pretty long stretch, and it's been a bit of a patchwork up until this project, which has confirmed what that right-of-way is. Additionally, using existing environmental information and mapping, the objective is to identify opportunities for a conceptual alignment, as well as how much it might cost to construct this. OSMP provided funding along with some other agency partners and the nonprofit. We provided funding for the study as part of a local match for a federal grant received to complete the study. OSMP also has participated in an interagency steering committee and is providing ongoing input throughout the feasibility study. A presentation similar to the information that I'm presenting to you tonight was shared with the Transportation Advisory Board for the City of Boulder on Monday. And the final feasibility study will be shared with the county commissioners in August. So identifying a conceptual alignment for the main corridor of the 11-mile bikeway has been a focus of the feasibility study. The county's goal, as I've mentioned, is to locate it within the existing highway right-of-way. Initially, both the east side and the west side of the highway were considered. However, the east side of the highway has been selected as the alignment for the main corridor. There are 4 site-specific locations that you see in those blue circles that require future analysis and more depth and a more in-depth study that's beyond the scope of the feasibility study. I also want to share that what this map is showing is that the bikeway corridor has been divided into segments. Segment 1 and a small stretch of segment 2. Let's see. I guess I don't know if my cursor works on this. But the yellow and the green, a small section of the green, are the areas where the bikeway would be adjacent to OSMP lands. So a finding of the study is that over 60% of the bikeway is expected to be well separated from the road and relatively easy to construct, while around 36% will be closer to the roadway, and it'll require barriers or structures. And with those challenges, it will be a little bit more expensive to construct. So here's the slide I was thinking would be next, and this is the typical bike design that can be achieved for, I said, about 64% of the 11-mile corridor. And it would be similar to what exists along US 36, the bikeway to the south between Boulder and Westminster. Where there's insufficient right-of-way or challenging terrain, the distance from the road would be reduced and barriers or guardrails would be added to provide physical separation. In these instances, the bikeway is widened a bit to provide additional clearance from barriers or railings on each side. So Boulder County hosted a virtual and an in-person meeting, as well as a project website for community members to learn about the study and to provide input on design elements. They provided an online survey that was posted to the website and received over 280 responses. I'd say the main takeaway is that there's just a lot of support for the bikeway, and most people who responded to the survey confirmed that they would ride it. Those riding the shoulder today and those not riding the corridor at all. Whoops, I think I skipped a slide. There we go. Let's make sure I didn't skip more than one. Okay. Although an overwhelming majority of the project can be built within the existing right-of-way, as I mentioned, there are a few specific locations where right-of-way width is simply insufficient to locate the bikeway in the right-of-way. And two of these would impact OSMP lands. They're both within segment 1. And both of these site-specific locations have been determined to require additional analysis and more detailed design in a future project phase. This would be to evaluate design alternatives further, to guide the selection of a preferred alternative, and to determine whether disposal of city open space land would be required or desired. So the first location is at the south end, and it regards basically a open space property that is between US 36 and Old Broadway. Conceptual alternatives, one of the conceptual alternatives would use OSMP land at the intersections where Old Broadway ties into US 36. And other conceptual alternatives that have been identified are exploring how to safely cross US 36 using a grade-separated crossing, basically an underpass. These would also require locating a portion of the bikeway on open space land. And what I'm showing you is the starting point for what would be evaluated further in the next design phase. It's just more of like, hey, this is what we've started thinking about, and realizing that this is beyond the feasibility study scope for let's look at this in the future. So the other location is in the vicinity of Neva Access Road. The area is circled in blue, which hopefully you can see. I don't know why I can't get my cursor to work, but so the area that's circled in blue is a pinch point where a segment of the bikeway would likely be located on open space land. Except for these two locations in the south end and at Neva Road, the feasibility study found that the bikeway can be contained within the right-of-way. The segment between the two blue circles is where the bikeway is in the CDOT right-of-way, and it's adjacent to open space. But there would be grading impacts that encroach onto open space lands, and that's anticipated intermittently. It's estimated that north of Old Broadway, where we're not sure what we're looking at in terms of the conceptual alignment. So what I have is a percentage north of there, that approximately 16% of the bikeway adjacent to open space lands would have grading impacts onto open space. And we don't anticipate that disposal would be required or desired in these locations. Grading is an impact that we think that is fine. Excuse me. So overall, OSMP staff supports design options that would require grading onto city open space. There is an exception, and that would be for locations within wetland, stream, and drainage areas. The feasibility study findings indicate that both the bikeway and grading can be contained within the right-of-way in these areas by installing retaining walls or barriers, as shown in attachment B of your packet for this memo. So overall, the feasibility study findings meet OSMP interests, and staff supports the conceptual alignment identified in the study. By keeping the bikeway on the east side of the highway and within the right-of-way for most of the route, its construction and use will have very minimal impacts to environmental resources. And more importantly, it will avoid the North Foothills Habitat Conservation Area that's on the west side of US 36. Additionally, the study has identified design alternatives to avoid or minimize use of open space as much as possible, as well as mitigate any impacts if the use of open space lands is needed. So the feasibility study consultant, another deliverable, is an opinion of probable cost for construction. And when you look at the figure here, it's a significant price tag. It's important to note that it does include contingency allowances and cost escalation projections. It's also pretty comparable to other transportation projects for bikeways, such as the Colorado 119 bikeway. And while the goal would be to complete the bikeway for the entire corridor length, any of the individual segments could be constructed as standalone projects that would provide a valuable facility on its own. In terms of the schedule and next steps, steering committee members have just received the final report for review. After incorporating our input, it will be presented to the Board of County Commissioners in August. And while the study findings are complete, further study at these, while the study has identified that further study is needed at some of these site-specific locations, that future phase is not yet funded, nor is construction for the bikeway. That said, Boulder County is actively pursuing funding opportunities and already thinking about the next phase of the project and hoping to proceed to that next phase. So the best resource for information on the feasibility study and updates on next steps is the county webpage for the study. And in closing, staff prepared a motion that's contained in your memo, and I've put it up here on the screen. Probably, if you want me to read it, I will. But the staff recommendation is for the board to consider this motion. And that's the end of my presentation. So I'd like to turn it back over to Michelle, our OSBT chair. Any questions? Let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you, Marnie. You always get the hard projects, don't you? E-bikes. Okay, clarifying questions from my fellow trustees before we open up for public testimony?
You talked a lot about cost in there. Just to clarify, this is being paid for by not the Open Space Department?
That's correct.
Okay.
It is a county project. I'm sure the county would love partnerships, but a lot of the transportation projects are funded by federal and state grants with some local funding as necessary coming from the local partners and Boulder County.
We have no CIP monies dedicated to this project through the 2029 CIP horizon.
Thank you.
Gosh, and we only contributed to $7,500 to the feasibility study, and we're the smallest contributor, right? Kind of embarrassing, but okay.
Except for those that didn't contribute anything.
Oh, okay. Okay, so question.
I've got another question. Would any of those future analysis required scenarios potentially require disposal? I know that requires more analysis, but is that part of the equation potentially?
Brady, yes. As part of the next phase, we would determine whether or not disposal would be required or desired. In the instances where the bikeway were to be located on open space land.
Is there anything that would preclude it from being on open space land without a disposal due to its multi-jurisdictional nature?
I would say the one thing would be if it was determined that class 3 e-bikes were permitted on the bikeway. At that point, I think that we are familiar with our decision for allowing e-bikes on our open space system, and we allow class 1 and class 2 e-bikes east of this corridor. So this corridor would be would likely allow e-bikes. So part of the next phase also is to understand what uses and whether or not class 3 e-bikes would be a use, at which point we'd have a hard answer, I think, in terms of disposal.
Yeah, and in terms
Hard
of
stop.
desirability, Marnie mentioned either required or desirable. Let's say the e-bikes isn't an issue for us and it meets a charter purpose for recreation, but there could be infrastructure, permanent infrastructure that for one reason or another, that open space, it's desired that maybe we don't own that infrastructure. So that would be more of a desire from our standpoint than a requirement, but it's unknown at this point.
Okay, thank you. And then I just wanted to reiterate, so the overall budget is 91 million, because from the schedule you showed I did the math in my head and it wasn't clear how all the numbers added up to 91. But that's the total soup to nuts number.
Yeah, and that includes contingencies, and it is preliminary figures. I think I received an email today that said there was an error in some of the numbers, so perhaps I didn't compare that to the updated version. But ballpark figure, I think let's just kind of go with that. The consultant has figured out what the unit costs are, and then, as I mentioned, contingency, as well as understanding like this isn't happening now, it's happening in the future, costs escalate. So it's a very ballpark figure, and you don't really have an answer until you put it out to bid and then see what happens. And that's well into the future from today.
Got it. The last question, would we anticipate a significant CIP line dedicated to this on some future OSMP budget?
Not anticipated.
But we wouldn't categorically exclude it, but.
I think that's right.
Okay. Thank you.
Harmon?
Yeah, so if it is also sort of for just clarity, curiosity's sake, if the county needed to do grading on OSMP land, even if the eventual bike trail was all in right of way, we would let the county do that without requiring them to get a temporary construction easement from us to work on our property?
I think we would have a temporary construction easement, but not a permanent easement. So easement's a little different than disposal.
Right. But we've been, talked to the city attorney about how kind of liberally been construing, the types of interests in land that require a disposal. So I'm just curious that, as to, is it OSMP's thought at this point that those kinds of temporary interests shouldn't require disposal?
True. And the desirability of a temporary construction easement is there's a lot of language in there about restoration responsibilities, seed mixes, that is desirable for us. So yes, we would definitely want to have an agreement about how that area would be to be restored, but it does not rise to the level of disposal.
Okay. And then the other question I had was, can you just explain why use is determinative when it comes to disposal? That whether as a class 1 or 2 e-bike versus a class 3 being a factor as to whether we decide to dispose is something I didn't understand.
I can start that, but Dan might
Or
pop
Bethany,
in,
too.
or
Good at it,
Bethany. Yeah, Bethany might be best to answer that. So let's.
So a disposal requires a conveyance, right? And so we have been navigating through this, that if a conveyance of an interest in the properties is not required, so an easement, a right-of-way conveyance, a deed is not required, the bikeway itself can be considered an open space purpose. because we do passive recreation, right? Once you get into the class 3 e-bikes, those aren't allowed on open space, right? Because under the ordinance. And so that escalates it into requiring, just like we did, and you guys probably have heard years ago, we had to convey a lot of our paved paths, right? Because e-bikes weren't allowed. And so it would escalate, it would elevate to that level as well. And then to elaborate on what Dan said as far as the temporary, yes, we call them temporary access and construction agreements, but any grading, any impacts that were to occur that are restorable on open space would still be subject to those very restrictive temporary access and construction agreements that talk about how they do it and how they restore it.
Well, I'm really grateful. Thank you for that explanation. Thanks, Bethany.
I have a question about something you said, Dan. You said that depending on the infrastructure that was built, that may push us into an area where we would want to dispose of land. Would a barrier wall qualify if they needed to build a barrier wall to protect the traffic from impeding on the bicyclists? Would that be infrastructure built on open space that would not be allowed, and therefore we would want to do a disposal?
Well, based on the input that we provided throughout the process and what the consultant has come up with, those barrier walls that are expected would be in the right of way. So we're not anticipating any barrier walls or railings or such that would encroach into open space.
I don't have a specific example in mind. I would just say that perhaps if there's some infrastructure or some part of this bikeway that can't be accomplished through a management agreement of some sort, where we just feel from our capacity, it would be undesirable for us to do it. I'm not thinking of anything specifically, but we're just putting it out there as a potential possibility, but not anticipating it, I guess.
Thank you. So let's go ahead and move on to public testimony.
Thanks. And we do have 2 people signed up in advance to speak. Thank you. We do have 2 people signed up in advance to speak, and I'm just wondering if they're here in person. So first we have Lisa Spalding and then Kathy Sullivan. Lisa Spalding, if you're, oh, perfect. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, couldn't see around the monitor. You could take a step up to the podium. You got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
So, Lisa Spalding, speaking on behalf of Plan Boulder County. First, our thanks to the board and staff for completing management area designations, especially for adding significant chunks of land to our largest, most valuable properties and designating them as habitat conservation areas. The HCAs in our beloved open space system are essential for achieving the Charter's first open space purpose: the preservation or restoration of natural areas, including terrain, geologic formations, flora or fauna that are unusual, spectacular, historically important, scientifically valuable or unique, or that represent outstanding or rare examples of native species. But this evening, we're here to speak in strong support of the North Foothills Bikeway. Too many bikers are being killed and hurt as they ride between Boulder and Lyons on US 36. We trust you will vote to support continued development of the byway by the collective OSMP, county, and CDOT group to provide a safe route for the 100,000 bikers that CDOT estimates will travel between Boulder and Lyons. We also urge you to pay special attention to the second part of your motion regarding the design and exploration of ways to reduce impacts of this bikeway on OSMP. The red dashed lines and arrows at the Foothills Trail and the Joder Trailhead indicate conceptual trail connections to safely connect bikeways to these trailheads, thus increasing non-vehicular access and reducing the pressure to expand parking. We remain very concerned about the impacts of the large number of bikers using the North Sky Trail on hikers and pedestrians. OSMP's 2019 scientifically sampled survey shows that an overwhelming 85% of OSMP users most frequently participate in hiking and walking. By comparison, 26% of users participate in dog walking, 27 in running, 24 in observing nature and wildlife. Although only 26% participate in biking, they displace pedestrian trail users because they are larger and faster. The impact of a large volume of bikes on the narrow North Sky corridor will make the experience of hikers and other pedestrians unsafe, less attractive, and more difficult to enjoy. We urge you and staff to enable users of all kinds to access and enjoy this new multi-use trail by making the trail open to bikes versus no bikes on alternating days, just as the county has successfully done on the Batasso Trail. Such a plan will provide all users with opportunities to connect to and enjoy nature as promised in OSMP's master plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Your proposal, just clarifying question, to limit the number of days that bikes are on there, that are you saying that, because we're talking about the bikeway here, and you're suggesting that we limit the number of days to bikes on the bikeway?
Hold on one second. I'm actually replacing the person who was unable to come today. So this isn't my specialty, but let's see.
Take your time.
Urge you to enable
Let's
and enjoy this new well, okay, hold on. The impact of a large volume of bikes on the North Sky corridor will make the, we urge you to access. I'm not sure. I'm sorry. But you know what? I'll send this to you.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can.
I think the reference is North Sky. That is a sentiment we have heard throughout the planning process for that. So yeah, that would be my assumption.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Okay, next, signed up in advance, we have Kathy Sullivan. And while Kathy is coming up to the microphone, if you are joining us on Zoom and would like to speak, please just raise your hand on Zoom.
I'm wearing my birdwatcher's hat. I'm Kathleen Sullivan. I am on the board of Boulder County Audubon Society, but I'm really speaking to you today as a birdwatcher, and the group of folks that characterize themselves as birdwatchers is actually a very specific group that's growing in numbers now due to eBird. And so more folks are coming out, becoming birdwatchers and enjoying, watching birds, and photographers are also jumping on it. So, and then they get converted very quickly to bird watchers. So I'm just talking about this specific group, and I will really be confirming a lot of, or agreeing with a lot of what the previous speaker said. Thank you so much for the North Sky Trail. It's just going to be fabulous. But we also are very concerned. Well, first of all, I'd like to applaud that this trail will be dogs on leash only, because we've got a lot of shrub nesting species in this habitat, and even one dog in breeding season off leash will destroy a nest, and it destroys it for the whole season. So that's a good regulation that you've constructed for that trail. However, we are concerned, as are others, about bike usage being increased and connections to the trail made from the design that's coming up with the new bikeway. So keeping this in mind, as you design the whole system, we ask that you have no bike days on this trail. This has been done successfully on the Boulder Batasso Trail. They selected Wednesday and Saturday for days without bikes. This will allow bird watchers, other seniors, even families with children to really enjoy the birds and the wildlife out there. And I had thought originally that we would have a slideshow here where we would sort of walk through. You've got the slides that have been sent to you, and at your leisure sometime, do go through those slides, because it will give you an idea of what it's like to walk that trail in peace and quiet if we didn't have bikes. And so, but we weren't able to do it since we couldn't get it on the big screen here. many bird watchers are seniors and they may have limitations in terms of hearing loss. And so bikes whizzing by, there are many trails and pathways in the city and county of Boulder that I won't go to as a bird watcher at all for safety reasons. You know, if you're concentrating on birds, you're maybe not paying attention as well. So the no bike days would allow these groups to really enjoy and safely enjoy this trail. So when you get a chance, do enjoy the slideshow. It's got some really good shots of birds and wildlife. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I have a quick question for you before you take off. If you and this temporal restrictions on North Sky is an issue that you're talking about. We're actually talking about the bikeway right now, but I know that you're branching into that conversation, and that's a much deeper conversation. But if in your proposal in which you suggest alternate days for bikers, where bikers would be allowed, would you also would you be open to the opposite of, okay, then those days that bikers are allowed, that there would be no hikers allowed?
You know, that might take us to a point of what's being called now mindful birding, where folks are going out with to find trails and places that are really quiet and peaceful. But I'm not really sure how hikers would be a problem, I guess, to the safety of bird watchers. Bird watchers would be passing the hikers and
I guess anybody on foot. So if you would, in your world, say that you wouldn't want bikers on certain days, would you also be willing to say, okay, there are going to be certain days that you wouldn't be allowed to go on there?
And bikers would?
Yes.
Is that your, oh,
Yeah,
I see what
yeah.
you're saying. Gee, I hadn't thought about that. I guess you would consider that more if you had like the bikeway itself, where you know you've got speeding bikes. But I'm just recommending that there be some days, it's a multi-use trail, you know, I mean,
Except on certain days. that
yeah,
you wouldn't.
everybody needs to share, but that there would be 2 days, one or 2 days a week where there would be no bikes. So it would be a safety factor, quiet and peace for those that are walking, hiking, or bird watching.
Okay. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you. We also have 3 people signed up to speak in person tonight. So first we have Jerry Kelly, followed by Bev Baker, and then Sally Greenwood. So Jerry, if you could come up here.
Good evening, board members. I'm Jerry Kelly, and I'm president of and I live in Boulder, and I'm president of the Boulder County Nature Association. We've been around since 1982 and have been working collaboratively with both the city and the county since that time. Yeah, my comments are related to the North Foothills Bikeway, but really on the impacts of to the North Sky Trail and the HCA's up there. Like others, BCNA is quite concerned about the potentially the heavy use in the HCA trails that will be coming from the North Foothills Bikeway, especially if there are the connections to Joder and Foothill trails are constructed. They could really have an adverse impact on the HCA ecosystems and the wildlife. So to alleviate this issue, we, like others, are recommending no bike days on this multi-use trail for non-bike users. for all the benefits that have been listed. In answering your questions, I think oftentimes non-bikers are excluded because of bikers. So we oftentimes tend to avoid these trails, at least at peak hours. So yeah, I think it's already happening. And that's why we'd like some no bike days. So we can go at a slower pace and observe, do photography. We also want, for this area, the HCA areas, we want the OSMP to still continue addressing invasive plants. That's a big concern. Construction and use of the trails will increase the presence and spread of invasive plants and thereby adversely impact the currently diverse and healthy ecosystems up there on the hills. I really like your mention, Dan, of the adaptive management approach. This is very important to us, and we would like a site-specific enforcement program to be put in place. I guess that's part of adaptive management.
Thank you, Jerry. You're over time. Do you want to take a few seconds to wrap up?
To wrap up, I just want to make sure that the city provides long-term funding and maintenance for future generation of these HCA trails. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you. Next, we have Bev Baker, followed by Sally Greenwood.
Good evening, trustees. Is my volume okay? I'm Bev Baker. I live in Louisville. I'm speaking on behalf of Boulder County Audubon Society Board of Directors and Conservation Committee. Boulder County Audubon represents over 1,400 members. Our mission is to be a voice for birds and wildlife conservation through habitat protection, advocacy, and nature education. We host a variety of programs and field trips that are open to everyone, and we sponsor research and restoration projects, including some on OSMP, I believe. Our Teen Naturalist program helps middle and high school students become the next generation scientists, naturalists, and conservationists. We recognize the public safety need for a bikeway along the North Foothills Highway. Given the proximity to OSMP lands and trailheads, we support OSMP continuing to collaborate with Boulder County on the bikeway. However, we, like others, are concerned about the bikeway facilitating an increase in visitors on the multi-use trails in the North Foothills HCA. Considering CDOT's 2020 bike count of nearly 92,000, if bikeway connections to Joder and Foothills trailheads are implemented, we believe this will greatly increase visitor numbers, especially bikers on the North Foothills trails, potentially beyond the lower visitor use levels appropriate for HCAs. I'll mention just a few of the invaluable natural resources at stake from the 2015 North TSA Inventory and Assessment Report that contributed to the HCA designation. 1, rare plant species and plant communities. 2, conservation focal species, lazuli bunting, a Boulder County species of special concern, lark sparrow and rock wren, all declining across the U.S. 9, rare butterfly species, and 4, 6 snake species, including 1 with suspected limited distribution in Boulder County. Also, the majority of the North Foothills HCA is designated as critical wildlife habitat in the Boulder County Comprehensive Plan due to the importance of the area to these species plus others, including nesting golden eagles. In addition to the significant natural resource concerns from increased visitor use, increased bike traffic on the North Foothills multi-use trails facilitated by the bikeway may unfavorably impact the experience of other visitors. We strongly support OSMP staff monitoring the use on North Foothills trails, especially the North Sky Trail, before and after bikeway construction, and considering designating no bike days. Many of our members are hikers, naturalists, scientists, bird watchers, including seniors and families, and would appreciate the opportunity to experience the special area safely and to observe and photograph the variety of birds, mammals, butterflies, plants, and other natural features. Thank you for the opportunity to comment this evening.
Thank you, Bev.
Okay, next we have Sally Greenwood.
Hi, I'm Sally Greenwood. I was fortunate to see the light and move to Boulder in 1991 and then put together enough to buy a townhouse on South Shanahan Ridge. Yay, that's my ranch down there, you all. We seem to be in a situation today of build it and they will come. We have the North Sky Trail, we have the bikeway. And I'm wondering, has there been any consideration as to how this is going to affect these two trails? I envision the bikeway as a safe highway for bicycles, road bikes, e-bikes maybe, but I can't see mountain bikers being enthusiastic about a paved highway. And as far as a multi-use trail, the North Skyway, I've hiked that when it was a grassy trail, a foot wide and quiet. And it was so pleasant to be able to walk and look down on those poor folks on 36 and know that I was having a good time in nature. And that seems to be something that's going to be compromised. And I regret saying that. The concept of making it a North Sky, a Batasso-esque trail sort of appeals as an alternative. But I'm wondering if it would really work. And I really am concerned about those 90,000 folks who are going to be on that nice paved road saying, ooh, we can go up the hill here and take a nice mountain bike ride. And I'm wondering, has there been
Hey,
any
Sally.
study
Sally,
about how that's
Sally.
going to happen?
Sally,
Yes,
would you please address us? Thank you.
talk to you?
Talk to the board.
I'm deaf.
Oh,
You talk to me.
no, I was watching you looking at staff, and I wanted to make sure that
Okay.
you addressed the board.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm hoping you're listening. Thank you. So what are the alternatives? And I'm concerned now that when I realize that these two trails are coming into existence at the same time, and there goes North Boulder, you know, where's the parking going to be? What's going to happen? I hope you're looking into that. And I was going to say today, I'm beginning to feel like a Prebbles jumping mouse. Cute, endangered, and ignored. So please take those into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Sam, do you have anybody else?
Okay, if you'd like to speak online, please raise your hand. Okay, we don't have any other hands.
Okay, I'll go ahead and close public testimony now and open up the floor for discussion. Okay, all right, people are gonna be shy. I'll go. Oh, you want to go, Brady? Okay, go.
Who's going?
Go for it, Brady.
Okay, I want to thank everybody who just testified for the thoughtful, passionate testimony. And I just want folks to know that I heard what you said, and I think considering temporal separation as is the term of art, I believe. That is to say, having certain times where there's certain kinds of use and certain times where there's other kinds of use is certainly one of the potential management tools I would see possibly being in play here. And I think it's, I'm going to disagree with the last speaker, Bev, that, maybe if we take the long view, we can say that these two trails are coming into existence at the same time. But from my view, they're not. I mean, we've been talking about North Sky for many years, and it's finally going to open in July. And before the North Foothills is going to open, we have to come up with 90 million somewhere, build the thing. I mean, I have no idea what a reasonable projection is for that being completed, but it's going to be quite a few years in the future. And I suspect that we'll learn a lot about how North Sky is used and can make good decisions in the future. I mean, the Boulder has changed. I can't imagine how much it's changed since 1991. That might be painful. It's going to continue to change whether we like it or not. And I think like I said, I just want to reiterate, I've heard you. I think everybody made great points. And I think we need to get this trail open and see what the usage patterns are, how the conflicts are, and if indeed older people who are hiking, bird watchers, and people with young families feel unsafe on the trail. And if that's the case, then I think we should take some management actions to address that in the future.
Thanks, Brady. I'm going to jump in, and unless you two want to speak. I guess back to my earlier comment about how we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about the bikeway, but we're talking about North Sky. North Sky was an incredible process in which the community, came together, worked through that alignment, got some easements, and I think there were a lot of compromises had. There are not that many places to bike single track trails in Boulder. I moved to Boulder, I think 2005, thinking it was going to be a mountain biking mecca, and in fact, it's not. There are very few places that mountain bikers can go. And so I know that was an entire process. We're about to open that trail, which is going to be amazing. There's a lot of comments tonight based on fear and not on data itself. And so I would ask that we all, my fellow trustees and staff and the community, keep an open mind about the launch of this trail. I will speak from my own experience where I used to bike a lot on 36, a lot of those areas. I used to do little mini triathlons and just really enjoy road riding, and I just won't do it today. Like, I absolutely will not get on the trail. And I've kind of resorted to being a Peloton owner, a Peloton rider, but because I'm just too afraid to get on the road with my bike. So I'm one of those people that would actually return to that area should there be separation, physical separation, and actually ride my bike outside. And I just want to give a perspective that we're assuming that the people who would ride on the bikeway are the same people that 91,000 people would now ride North Sky. There's just some differences in those people. There's some basic differences in just equipment. And so if you were to ride on 36, you've got to have a road bike, right? You've got to have a road bike. You're not going to then take that road bike onto the trail because you're going to get a flat right away. And you're at 120 PSI, you're just, a lot of pressure on those bikes. You're just not going to do that. The same is true for mountain bikers. So mountain bikers are riding bikes with nubby tires, fatter wheels that can handle the terrain out there and at lower pressure points. So getting on the bikeway and like making a loop out of that is just not feasible because it would be a lot more effort to be able to ride those thicker tires at lower pressure on a bikeway. So I think that's just, wanted to provide some sort of background on like why you're not going to see 91,000 people then go do that. those are different people. I'm not never was an elite athlete. And so I know a lot of those people who ride 36 and are fearless are elite athletes. A lot of people, maybe like me, maybe not like me, would actually go out there more because they are afraid to go for their lives to go out there because it's such a dangerous highway. So I appreciate everybody who spoke up in person tonight. Also appreciate all the people in support of the bikeway who emailed us and didn't make it here tonight. So I think that we have some interesting perspectives to all take in, and hope that we will have an open mind when it comes to North Sky itself, and then also return to the topic of the bikeway. And I just want to say that I absolutely support the bikeway, and I absolutely support it, welcome it, and want it here. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I thought one of the little buried headlines was in the survey where they asked the people who ride on the shoulder now who would take the path, and only 75% said yes. That means that 25% are saying, you can build me a $91 million multi-use path, I'll still ride on the road. And those are the elite athletes you're talking about. I think the people who are doing 30 miles an hour on their bikes aren't going to be on the multi-use path. They'll stay on the highway. And everybody I know who's a serious, athlete bike rider doesn't want to be on a multi-use path because there are too many interactions. They'd rather be out with the cars. They're crazy as far as I'm concerned, but that's what they do.
In talking about the North Foothills Bikeway, it seems like a really great thing for the community to keep bikers off the road who are willing to do it. I'm in the 95% of people who would ride on it if it was built. I've never driven up 36 to Lions, but I would consider it if the bikeway was there. There's a lot of precedent for us to partner for transit trails and connections using open space land and partnering with other agencies. So this motion has my full support.
Excellent. So would anybody like to make that motion?
You want to make one tonight, Michelle?
Brady's up.
I don't have it in front of me. I'm looking for it. Someone, oh, there it is. I'll move. Thank you. I'll move that the Open Space Board of Trustees support a North Foothills US 36 bikeway to connect Boulder and to Lions, including the use city open space for the bikeway at the specific locations of Old Broadway and Neighbor Road, and grading impacts onto city open space adjacent to the bikeway, and to support the department's continued collaboration with Boulder County on the next phase of the project, which will include further analysis and design, including exploring ways to reduce OSMP impacts and the selection of a preferred design alternative, i.e. specific trail alignment.
Thanks, Brady. Does anybody want to second that?
I'll second it.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. Do we want to have any additional discussion?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the fact that OSMP pitched in $7,500, it does help to buy a place at the table, and I think what we're really being asked to do here is to support OSMP collaborating with the county as they design the project, because it's going to have some impacts on OSMP lands, and I really do support OSMP working with the county and their transportation department and their POSAC to build the best path that we can build. So I'm going to vote yes.
Thanks, Harmon. Okay, I'll go ahead and call the roll and see. Trustee Carroll.
Yes.
Robinson.
Yes.
Zuckerman.
Yes.
And Michelle, me, yes. Okay, that passes unanimously.
Thank you, Marnie. Thank you, trustees. We're going to be moving into matters from the department. I'm wondering if we want to take a couple of minute break, even though I know we're behind, but some of us might need a small little break.
Okay, let's do that. I mean, Dan needs a break.
And then staff could get set up. I think we have Heather coming up next. So
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. It's aimed to be back as soon as possible, but no later.
Okay, all set.
All right, we have two matters from the department tonight, and our first is another visit with you on our bear habitat suitability and seasonal on-leash trail regulations project that has been ongoing for the past couple of years. And we are coming forth with two proposed changes as well as some additional follow-up work. And to walk us through that are going to be two members of our staff. One here live tonight. Start off with Heather Swanson, our Deputy Director of Resource Stewardship.
Thanks. Heather, before you go, I just want to, for the record, Leah, let you know that Brady has dropped. Okay, thank you. We still have a quorum. Go ahead, Heather.
Good evening. Again, Heather Swanson, Deputy Director of Resource Stewardship. I'm going to see if I can get there we go. Nice. So tonight I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about our bear habitat suitability evaluation, as well as the seasonal on-leash program that exists on some of our foothills trails. And also joining me tonight is Ryan Prioresci. Ryan Prioresci is one of our wildlife ecologists and took the lead on the bear habitat suitability field evaluation. So I'll hand it over to him in a little bit to talk about that part of the process. But first, I just very quickly want to go over sort of where we have been. This has been something that the board and staff have been discussing over several years. And I just wanted to sort of highlight that this is kind of an interesting example of adaptive management that we've been talking about. When we talked with you about our adaptive management guidelines a little over a year ago, I think, we talked about sort of big wheel adaptive management, which is sort of the classic large planning process where you have a lot of information put in, large public process, decision makers involved, staff involved, and you sort of go through this iterative process of coming up with a policy, implementing it, seeing how it's working, and then reevaluating. Really, this is what we're considering that smaller wheel. So after you've implemented and you watch to see how things are working, you may then want to make changes or small tweaks to the program that don't really involve a complete overhaul that would then need to be a large overarching process again. So that's sort of the space that we're operating in here, is that little wheel adaptive management, not evaluating the entirety of the program, but looking at pieces of it and how it's working and making modifications with those. So we started with the Visitor Master Plan and the West TSA, sort of confirming the seasonal on-leash requirements on trails. These were implemented in the late 90s before the Visitor Master Plan, but were then discussed as part of that process as well as the West TSA. Then in 2020, as our staff were presenting some of the compliance data that they had gathered, they were highlighting that compliance for the seasonal on-leash requirements was below the targets that we had set in the VMP for compliance. And so in 2021, we tested some strategies to see if we could increase compliance. Things like changing the types of signs that we were using, adding additional signs, having more staff out in the field to do outreach with the users, and increased patrol. And so at the time then, some questions came up about, okay, so we're making all this effort to try and increase compliance. Do we know that these are still in the right places? Since the West TSA, we had the 2013 floods, we had rerouted some trails, and so conditions on the ground had changed. And so in 2022, we began looking at bear habitat to answer that question of, are these still in the right places? And we did a desktop analysis with GIS data in 2022, and in 2023, we presented that to you and made a few small tweaks related to where bear habitat was based on that spatial data, as well as making it more understandable in the baseline meadow and bluebill bear trail complex area of Chautauqua near Gregory Canyon. So then in 2024, then in 2023, the fall of 23, we went out to gather more information. We realized through that desktop analysis that our vegetation mapping and spatial data wasn't really sufficient to give us the detail that we needed on the habitat quality for those sections of trail. So in the fall of 2023, we undertook the in-field analysis of the data and data collection that Ryan's going to talk about. And so we're here tonight in 2024 to present the analysis of that data and where we looked at the consistency between the existing regulations and where that bear habitat exists on the ground. So where we are now, in 2022, there were 3 different things set out for future steps. The first of those is really what we're looking at tonight, and that was evaluating if bear activity had changed or if seasonal leash regulations targeted the most effective locations and duration of the season for reducing conflict. We had some other things that we were hoping to look at that we're not going to be talking about tonight, but maybe future steps. So why are we talking about bears and why are we only talking about the fall? Obviously, bears are iconic residents of our Boulder, entire Boulder system. They make it all the way out into the plains sometimes, and are important members of our wildlife communities. And the reason that we're really talking about fall is a really intense time in the life cycle of a bear. And this is one way where bears really differ from other species because they are full hibernators. And so in the fall, prior to hibernation, they are needing to consume at least 20,000 calories per day, which is 10 times their normal food intake for the spring and summer, in order to put on sufficient weight to be able to enter hibernation and make it through the winter. And in order to do this, they're often foraging 20 hours a day. And so as a result, disturbances to their ability to focus on finding food and consuming food can then have really negative consequences on their survival and their success of making it through the winter. And finally, bears are a species that are very visible to people, very visible to dogs. When they move around in drainages, they make a lot of noise. And so there can be negative interactions, whether that's just a bear avoiding an area because there are people or dogs in there, or people or dogs being startled by bears that they've seen in a drainage. And so that's really why bears are the focus of this rather than a wider suite of species like we use some of our other regulatory mechanisms to address. And so in order to address this, like I said, in the late 90s, the regulatory framework that was created was seasonal on-leash regulations for specific trails in close proximity to drainages. So the first thing that we started to look at was the duration of the season that seasonal leash exists. And ever since it was implemented back in the 90s, it has been August 15th to November 1st. But we've known over the last couple of decades that bear activity in and around Boulder routinely stretches well into December, but certainly to December 1st in almost every year. And so over the last several years, staff have been collecting information and having conversations with Colorado Parks and Wildlife officers to see the types of calls that they get about bear conflicts and what the seasonality of those is, what the timing of conflicts within the urban area of Boulder is. And so Val Matheson collects data on that, as well as our animal control officers for Boulder. And so we can see that those conflicts are continuing well into December in most years. And then finally, OSMP observations of our rangers in the field, observations of staff members that are out in the field, as well as remote cameras that we have set up and when they detect a bear. And so the first change that we're looking at making is to move the end date back to December 1st to capture more of that active season when more bears will then be going into hibernation after that date. We know that this won't capture all of them, but hopefully this will do a better job of capturing the majority of that foraging season. And I'm now going to turn it over to Ryan. Ryan, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself, and then he'll be talking about the habitat evaluation.
Hi, I'm Ryan Parrish. I'm one of the wildlife ecologists. I've been with Open Space for about 14 years now. So in the fall of 2023, we started trying to assess the fall forage habitat for bears, and on mostly along trails that allow off-leash dogs. We did include a few other trails just kind of for a comparison that do not allow dogs. And one of the main characteristics we were looking at was mass-bearing shrubs. So shrubs that produce some sort of fruit that the bears like to eat in the fall. And that was our main measurement. And it was and we were using that as an analog for bear fall forage habitat because we're not monitoring the bears directly. And 2 important points I want to make about the data is this is only looking at bear fall forage habitat. It wasn't any other type of habitat. It wasn't related to other wildlife or habitat that the bears may be using at other times of the year. We're specifically tasked with looking at the fall usage. So that's kind of what we focused on for the data. Next up. So we ended up surveying 11 drainages totaling 8.2 miles. We surveyed or monitored the continuous habitat, but every 200 meters we stopped to take more in-depth point data. And so the continuous habitat, we tried to create habitat blocks that all looked like similar data and then gathered the data every 200 meters. And so those are the categories you can see below: the distance from the trail to the riparian corridor, the width of the riparian corridor, the total understory and overstory canopy, what kind of mass-bearing shrubs were there, and the percentage of the species, open ground, and yeah, that was all of them. And then so after we got all of our data, we started crunching the numbers. We picked the 4 categories you can see in table 1. And those are basically a makeup of the 8 categories that we collected, and then scored them 0 to 3, with 0 being non-habitat, 3 being really high habitat. And then we averaged the scores for each point to get, and then put those into what you can see on table 2, which just to get our high, medium, and low quality habitats and non-habitat as well. And then the point data was extrapolated into the segment data that we had collected to show segments of drainage versus just individual points. And so that data kind of breaks out like you can see in this table. I won't go into too much detail, but you can see we had a wide array of habitat types and distances throughout the system. And that's displayed here on a map as well. It's probably a little small on the screen, but it should be it's the same map that's in your packet. So you can refer to that for more detail. And I'll hand it back over to Heather.
Thanks, Ryan. So we took the data that Ryan and the wildlife team collected as he displayed on the map, and then overlaid that where we had current seasonal on leash restrictions and where we didn't. And what we found was there was good alignment for a number of trails on the system. The Gregory Canyon Trail above the Crown Rock intersection, the Ski Jump, Meadows, and Bluebell Baird trails, Skunk Canyon, and the Dowdy Draw Trail above Springbrook Loop had good overlap where we had on-leash restrictions where there was high-quality habitat and we didn't where there wasn't. So that we're not suggesting any changes to those at this point. But there was some inconsistency between the habitat suitability data and the existing seasonal on-leash regulations for a few trails. And these are the lower section of Gregory Canyon, the Amphitheater Saddle Rock Loop, the Mesa Trail between Bluebell and Enchanted Mesa, the Bear Canyon Trail, Upper Big Blue Stem, Shadow Canyon South, and the Lower Dowdy Draw Trail. And so we looked at these in more detail to determine if there were any actions that made sense given that inconsistency. So there were 3 of these where we thought that no change or implementing actions other than seasonal on-leash restrictions made the most sense. The first of these was the lower section of Gregory Canyon, and this is a section just up to the Crown Rock intersection, and it's actually less than 1/10 of a mile. And so we decided that the complexity that would create in regulations really probably wasn't worth it for that 1/10 of a mile of trail. So we think we should leave this one as is. The Amphitheater and Saddle Rock Loop is a little bit more complicated situation. What we have is both Amphitheater and Saddle Rock follow drainages through bear habitat for the lower sections of the loop and then climb up and out of the habitat for the upper section of the loop. But there aren't good breaking points in those trails where we could easily communicate a change in regulations in order to be able to remove it just from the top half of the loop. So we discussed options about leaving it on one trail and not the other, what we could do, and really after discussing with rangers the fact that this is the place on the system that they most frequently observe bears of anywhere, we made the decision that we thought that we should leave the seasonal leash as it is. And then finally, the Mesa Trail between Bluebell and Enchanted Mesa. This is a little section of trail that drops down into the, into the McClintock drainage down from the Bluebell Road and then climbs pretty quickly back up towards Enchanted Mesa. So it's really just the area where it quickly crosses the drainage there. It's a very short section And so it didn't make a lot of sense to put a regulation just in there where people would have to leash their dogs and then could take them right back off. In addition, we've got some observations of social trailing up and down the drainage, probably from all different types of users. And so we think looking at something more like signs or fencing that might help us to not only protect the bears during the fall, but also keep people on the trail year round may be the best approach there. And then there were two trails that we decided needed further evaluation. Bear Canyon Trail, we did not get the data collected in last fall before the weather turned and the shrubs dropped their leaves. So we're planning to go collect the habitat data on Bear Canyon next year. And this is really a fairly short section of Bear Canyon because the upper and lower sections of Bear Canyon are already on leash. It's just the section where it kind of follows the Mesa Trail for a short period of time where the regulation changes if you're hiking up Bear Canyon. And then the second one is the Upper Big Blue Stem Trail. So this is a trail that was rerouted as part of the West TSA with the intent of removing it from the drainage and then no longer needing seasonal on-leash requirements. So the trail was rerouted. Unfortunately, due to the topography and the need for trail sustainability, there are still sections that are in very close proximity to the drainage. And at the time, the regulations then were switched to what is now one of the most complicated dog regulations that we have on our system, where we have different days of the week for on-leash versus voice and sight for dogs. And that was just the switch that was put in during the CCG deliberation process. So this is one that I think rangers and our rec stewardship staff would like to look at more holistically, because it is very difficult right now for visitors to understand. And we thought overlaying a separate yet different regulation probably would only make things worse. So we'd like to look at this more comprehensively. And then there were two sections where it really was indicated that it made sense to make changes to the seasonal on-leash where they exist now. And the first of these is the Shadow Canyon South Trail. And you can see that in the upper part of the map. Again, these maps are in your packet, so if they're hard to see on the screen, which I know they often are, you can look more closely in the packet. This is the section of Shadow Canyon that essentially splits off from the Mesa Trail as you head west in this kind of South Mesa Trail area. So a little bit further south than Upper Big Blue Stem is. And this section of trail follows the drainage directly adjacent to the drainage up to the Stockton Cabin, if you've ever been in that area, where it then rejoins the rest of the Shadow Canyon Trail, which is not in close proximity to the drainage. And so this is a segment of about 1.1 miles of high quality bear habitat where we have not had a seasonal on leash restriction that lies in very close proximity to the drainage. So this one really seemed to indicate that adding a seasonal on leash regulation from that August 15th to December 1st made sense. And then the second one is an area that we're looking to remove some of the seasonal on-leash restriction. Dowdy Draw has the seasonal on-leash beginning at the Community Ditch intersection and then continuing west from there. The habitat between Community Ditch and the Springbrook Loop Trail is really very low quality or no quality bear habitat. There's not much of a shrub component and we don't really see bears in there. So it seems to make sense to remove the on-leash for that segment of the trail. So leashing wouldn't start until people get up to the Springbrook Loop intersection, which is about 0.9 miles further up the trail than currently they would need to leash their dogs during those fall months. So as far as next steps, we certainly wanted to talk with you tonight, have a chance to answer any questions that you have and collect any comments that you have. And after tonight, we'll be further communicating changes to the 2024 seasonal on leash between now and August 15th when regulations will go into effect. We did have some public outreach ahead of time, but we want to do a broader outreach effort to make sure that people understand what the regulations will be. We'll then need to update, modify, and deploy any new signs that are needed and any updates to regulations that are required, although those will be fairly minimal. And then next fall, we would collect additional habitat data on the Bear Canyon Trail. And then into the spring of 25, we'd evaluate any changes that might be indicated on that trail based on that habitat data that's collected. And then finally in 25, we would seek to look at that more comprehensive evaluation of the upper Big Blue stem and the complexities that exist there from a regulatory perspective and what the best approach is longer term on that one. And I think that's all that we have, if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Heather. I have a list of questions, but I would not assume I should go first. Okay, so Heather, thank you for the presentation and all your work here, and Ryan too. You mentioned that you did some public outreach and you'll do some more between now and August 15th. What has that looked like so far?
So we sent an email to the FIDO's board last week when the packet came out and sent them a link to the packet so that they had an opportunity to read the packet ahead of time and know that it was on tonight's agenda, and asked for any questions or feedback from them at the time, but we didn't receive any before tonight. So after this, it would be more of outreach focused at those locations where the seasonal unleash exists, to communicate the change in timing in all of those places, and in those places where we would be either adding or removing the regulation, making sure that we have information available to the public so they know what to expect come August.
Okay. Why is your communication, I'm just comparing this to the process that we've been talking through with the climate access trails. And the engagement has happened much sooner in the process before decisions were made or even a proposal was made. And so I just want to get a sense for why we have engagement happening after this. Just basically when a packet, you've already typed up the packet and you've distributed to the broader public rather than having engagement earlier on in the process.
Yeah, I think there are a couple reasons for that. Dan can certainly add to those if he has some thoughts. I think the first is that fundamentally this is a pretty different program. So this is a long-standing regulation that's been going on for 30 some years and has been discussed in multiple public processes and planning processes in the past. And really what we're looking at again are kind of these fine-tuned small changes within the program framework. The second is, I think that climber access trails are really a unique situation where that's not only engagement, but also shared learning. I think that the information that the climbers have about the climbing access trails and the situations on those sites certainly adds to and complements the information that staff has going into that process. So I think there's really a lot broader need to have early sort of back and forth engagement before we're moving towards any type of decision making.
Okay, that's fair. I do recall that there was early engagement when we expanded the closures for raptors, though. And so that seems more similar to what we're doing here. And I just recall there being earlier engagement. And I would just encourage earlier engagement. I guess that's my bottom line. I have more, but do you want to go, John? I don't want to dominate here. This is just a stupid question, Heather, is we see a lot of bears in town, dumpster diving. And I just wanted to understand, like, we're talking about bear we're talking about bear habitat and where they can get their food. And we're also kind of talking about bear conflict. And so, but we see, is there a correlation between how often those bears are coming into town? Like, is that because of conflict? Is it because of lack of food in those drainages? Could you just educate me there?
Yeah, I think there are probably a number of reasons. We do know that if we have a year where the fruiting shrubs have a failure, so usually that comes because we have a late freeze, and so the plums and the choke cherries and stuff don't produce fruit, we usually see an uptick in conflict in town. Why certain bears choose to enter town is hard to know. They've done a lot of studies in other communities on that, and it seems like it's a very complicated situation where you have some bears that actually learn from their mother how to do it, other bears who don't have their own territory and are sort of pushed out into those peripheral areas, and other bears who just opportunistically happen across something and realize that a sheet cake tastes a whole lot better than a plum and are just kind of hooked. So it really depends, I think. And bears' behavior is plastic enough and based enough on learning that I think there's a lot of individual variability as far as that. So it's hard to point to one cause. And I think from year to year and individual bear to individual bear, it probably changes.
Okay. I just hear people say, well, bears are getting plenty to eat, but they're coming into town and diving into our trash cans. Anyway, there's enough stuff up there. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you about the temporal changes. So we know that climate change is real, and the season in which bears are foraging before they hibernate is changing. Is it changing on the front end too? Is August 15th still the right date?
We believe so. And really that's because we have not seen the seasonality for the ripening of the fruit changing much. Once those kind of significant food resources become available, they sort of switch into that hyperphagia mode. And really, in an ideal bear's world, they would be able to get enough calories and put on enough weight before December 1st to be able to go into hibernation. But that's just not realistic for most of them. So they need that longer period to reach their hibernation weight. So in some years, it might be later, again, if we have a very late season. But in other years, it might actually be a little bit earlier than that.
Okay, I have one more question and a comment. I want to talk about Skunk Canyon because your assessment was nothing ought to change there, but there was a massive reroute that took a lot of the trail away from the drainage. And so I'm just confused by why that nothing has changed there considering that massive reroute.
Yeah,
away
and I
from the
think
drainage.
I unfortunately don't have, since that one came up just earlier this evening, we don't have a specific map to show you that one. But, and I can certainly have Ryan, who spent some more time out there in the field than I have recently, but portions of that trail were rerouted. The portions that have the seasonal on-leash restrictions on them still are in pretty close proximity to the drainage. So they're further than they were originally, which was essentially in the drainage. But they're still very close to the drainage and well within a distance that, you know, having dogs off leash might have an impact on whether or not bears would choose to forage there.
It would have been helpful to have a little more information in the packet about how you came to that conclusion rather than just 2 bullet points saying that things hadn't changed, just listing the names of the areas that hadn't changed. So just a little bit of feedback when I was trying to understand why you thought, you concluded that Skunk Canyon hadn't materially changed despite the reroute. So you're saying that it's, despite the reroute, it's still close enough or too close to the trail itself is too close to the drainage. How close is too close? Do you have a metric that says?
Well, yeah, so Ryan showed, I can go back to the, that factored into, or actually, I guess that wasn't in your table, Ryan, but the distance from the trail to the bear habitat was measured as part of the habitat evaluation. And I will say for Skunk Canyon, the reason that I didn't include more data on that is that the decision to keep the seasonal on leash there was made long ago after the reroute, which would have been, gosh, I don't know if anybody here knows when that reroute was, 2012, maybe 2011. And so that's been the situation for a long time. What we were really looking at is, has the habitat changed since that was last evaluated? And what we found was no, it's still very high quality habitat.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That's the end of my questions, but my parting comment is related to, and I know it's not within the scope of this particular project because you're strictly examining the bear habitat, but I would plead to the department to consider in the balance of off-leash trails are seasonal on-leash requirements. And the point about, yes, it's mileage roughly the same, but totally different experience. I would not want a dog off leash with where you have now made that change on Lower Dowdy Draw. It's just not a good place to have an off leash dog. And Shadow Canyon is an amazing experience. And I think that is probably what Lori was getting at here about it feeling like a net loss. It's not really due to mileage. And so in the grand scheme of things, I would just ask that the department, not within the scope of bear habitat, think about other opportunities in which they can offer off-leash dogs.
And I would say that the kind of the area that we're talking about is, when we look at voice and sight opportunities, system-wide is a tiny fraction of the areas that provide voice and sight. I mean, even if you take all of the trails that have had the seasonal on-leash and add the new one, that number of trails and trail mileage is, something less than 2%, I think. I haven't done that calculation, but we are talking about a really tiny minority of the system that allows off-leash dogs.
Right. Just happens to be a really good part of the system.
The bears think so too.
Yeah. Go for it, John.
Do you have any sort of educational initiatives to ensure dog walkers understand the importance of these rules for protecting wildlife? It's something I've learned since being on the board a bit more, and it's something that I think might help build some bridges with the community there.
Certainly, and I don't know if Janelle Freeston's here, but certainly through the years, we have had a number of those types of conversations. Dog walkers are definitely one that we have some very targeted education campaigns around. A lot of times it's around etiquette and picking up poop and other things like that, but we certainly pepper into that some of the interactions between dogs and wildlife and other natural resources. As part of the sort of pilot that happened with increased education and outreach a couple of years ago in the Chautauqua area, certainly the messages that they were providing were very focused on exactly those things. Why is this important? Why are we asking you to do this? And I don't know, Janelle, if you have anything that you want to add, but those are the types of things that we do. I will say also that we have just about a month ago, maybe had a meeting with the FIDO's board and discussed really using their newsletter as one way to have a better connection with at least their members in some of the messaging that Open Space has around a variety of issues, but certainly some of that could be around this.
Hello, Janelle Freeston, Deputy Director of Community Connections. So we have, with our volunteer team, I'll speak to that for a minute, we have our new pilot dog ambassador program, which started last fall. And so, yeah, they are definitely really focusing on dog outreach and education. And then all of our trail guides are trained and take the voice and sight class as well. So they have the talking points to be able to do that. And then our outreach staff and education staff, when they're doing trailhead outreach, they'll be interpreting the appropriate dog regs for those areas. And then of course our rangers, when they're doing roving patrol, they're educating as well. So does that answer your question?
Awesome.
And that actually made me think, Janelle, have any of you been through our voice and sight classes with your dog? So there's certainly messaging in there about interactions between dogs and wildlife that every dog with a voice and sight tag has learned, right?
Yeah, my dogs are not that well behaved. Mine are on leash year round. But I've actually, I don't know if you call me lucky, unlucky. I've had many bear encounters actually on the trails with my dogs when hiking, which caused me to do some research on it, and I have a lot more respect for why those rules are in place after those encounters. And I think there's an opportunity to build some bridges there, with our neighbors that like furry friends. Maybe we can convince them, to like our bear furry friends as well. And why it's important to have parts of the year where dogs are off leash. Also, there were some of the trails you mentioned where there were weird rules, and wanting to look at them more holistically. that could be another place to kind of build some bridges with the community in terms of clarifying those, making them simpler, or, whatever we do there.
Go ahead, Harmon.
Thanks, Michelle. So just a question. What does the signage regime look like? I'm hiking Mesa Trail, the Bluebell section, I got to have the dog on the leash. How do I know that?
So I know a couple of years ago when we did some pilot efforts, we were using sort of the sandwich boards that might be a little bit more visible and that people aren't used to seeing. We certainly have signage at the trailheads. And I don't know, Jeff, if you know specifically what our standard signage is, but again, it's a fairly small number of areas, so it's not hard for us to sign kind of those specifically.
For our visitor experience and infrastructure, we can certainly put the signacades, also known as sandwich boards, out during this kind of new area that we've had changes in regulations. But to answer your question, Harmon, when you reach kind of a decision point or a mile marker or a change in trails, there's typically a 4x4 post, and it has the little signs on there, and it'll say voice and sight and kind of explain the voice and sight program. And if it's a seasonal leash, then it'll have an additional sign that actually has some red and black font on it that's a little more of kind of like a warning, and it'll typically identify seasonal leash required. So that's usually what you see on an ongoing basis, like if you go out there now and experience some of these trails that Heather's been talking about. But when we are, like she said, changing regulatory situations, we'll have a little more information. But that's typically what you see.
So, Jeff, you're saying that some of the seasonal bear closures have signs that are up all year round, and others, a ranger's got to go out there and put up a sandwich board and take it down at a certain time of year?
There is some staff work. Some of the signs we kind of flip. So during the season, when it is voice and sight, it'll say that, and then the staff will actually flip it over, and it'll have a red and black to kind of really clearly indicate this is a seasonal leash. But yeah, each season there's some work to go out and change the signage. The signacade sandwich board aren't necessarily required all the time. It's more special situations or circumstances. Those are used when, again, you typically only see those when there's something, either a trail closed or some new information. Those will be deployed. Trail closure, or if a bear has been active in an area and we've, be extremely cautious or something like that.
Yeah. I'm no expert on this, but I think that if I were to just give you a layperson's take, maybe having a bigger sign, and I know that there's issues with aesthetic values as well, but to explain to the public that, we're not trying to save your dog. This is about providing bear habitat at a crucial time of year for the bear. It could have a pretty impactful result on the way people behave. And I think people who hike want to know, they've got their Strava, or they've got Cotrex up. They want to know, like, this is going to be for the next 0.75 trail miles, and then I can take the dog back off the leash again. So, more data and more reasons from an ecological perspective would certainly impact me as a user of the trails and a dog owner.
Right. That's good input.
I have some input regarding the sandwich boards, and I think you'll get increased compliance if you actually handed out sandwiches.
And during bear foraging.
You get impact for the bears or
The
for
bears.
the trail users?
Trail users.
Carry a sandwich.
Ooh, we've got sandwich boards, got sandwiches. Oh, I should stop and read it. And I just wanted to comment on the voice and sight class. It's very good. I did that class with my kids, and we decided that our dog should not be off leash. And you have to stop and answer the questions, and like, oh no, he can't do that. So it works both ways. So I really want to commend you on designing a really good class there. Any other questions, comments on this topic? Because I'm blowing it tonight in terms of the time frame. It's 9:05 and the meeting's adjourned. No joking. We got to talk about the budget. And poor Lauren and Sam, because it's so hot and we're so.
Well, luckily we've given you a whole nother meeting for budget, so a little less pressure tonight. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Ryan. Yeah, so come on up, folks, but we've explained it in the memo. We had a chance to explain more thoroughly to Michelle about our reasoning for wanting to separate July's meeting from decision-making and more data. There's just going to be more new data in July than we expected. And we know it's hard as a trustee to get more data on the spot and then also expect to deliberate that same night. So what we're hoping we do is that most all new information will be given by July, the meeting, and then August, very little changes, kind of tweaks, but more of a chance for you to deliberate on what you've heard. So that was the reasoning behind establishing the August meeting for your deliberations and separating it out from meetings where you're continually trying to digest new information. So just wanted to explain that a little bit. And I also bought some time for our two presenters. We're going to start off with our senior accountant, Cole Moffitt, who will walk through the first part of the presentation, and then Sam will bring us to close on the presentation portion.
Yeah. All right, let's get started. Good evening, trustees. Good to see you again. Cole Moffitt along with Sam McQueen. We're going to kick off a draft 2025 budget update for y'all. All right, so what we're going to be looking at tonight, we'll let you know where we're at in the budget development process. We'll also take a look at the operating budget structure and the ins and outs and the basic things you need to know, as well as what Dan just mentioned, some changes to the operating process or change to the July meeting in terms of timing. And as always, some questions at the end or time at the end for any questions that you may have. So tonight is our third touch of the budget, if you can believe it. And we have, like Dan mentioned, a change to the proposed timeline. We've worked with the finance department to finalize some budget information, and we're going to postpone that into the July meeting for public hearing and OSBT recommendation. This was previously scheduled in July. Now the final recommendation will be in August. In July, we'll just have more detailed information for you to review, so you have more time to digest, ask questions, and our finance staff will actually be present at the July meeting, so you can ask them any specific questions directly as well. So where we're at in the budget process. So the finance department is continually refining projections and revenues over the months as economic details come in. And we'll have more details on that next month for you. But these include final projected costs for staff salaries and benefits, which make up 2/3 of our operating budget. So it's pretty important. And we'll touch more on those later in this meeting. But we'll be submitting our final budgets to the finance department later this month on the 21st, and then they will be reviewed by the city's executive budget team. So last month we focused on CIP, and we've also provided a list of potential upcoming CIP projects in the attachment A of the memo. But tonight's presentation will set the foundation for the operating budget, which will continue into next month, where we'll also bring the CIP, the operating budget, revenues, and reserves all together into a holistic picture. So the operating budget is comprised of a few different layers. It starts with the current year's base, and then additional costs from budget guidelines are layered on top of that for such things as like vehicle repair and technology costs, et cetera. And so the finance department also provides revenue projections, which we review against these expenses. And as we have accounted for these new costs and the revenue outlook, we can look to adjust core service budgets accordingly. And these are reviewed for priority and feasibility to implement either on a fixed term or an ongoing basis. And any increase beyond the base and budget guidelines requires a request. And we'll talk about budget requests later in this presentation as well. But within the operating budget, there are really 4 different expenditure types. We have personnel expenses, which we call PE. non-personnel expenses, which we call NPE, cost allocation, and debt service. And it's important to know that the Open Space Fund supports these entirely. Previously, we used to have a subsidy from the general fund and or lottery dollars, but now in 2025, it is fully managed by the Open Space Fund. And we will continue to determine, our city leadership will continue to determine if the recent climate tax will play any role of this in moving forward. Next slide. And so here is a visual representation of how we organize everything into programs. The 25 structure will also follow the 2024's structure, with our main operating programs being administration, central services, community connections, resource stewardship, and visitor experience and infrastructure. This packet this month also details what we're calling sub-programs in the city. So sub-programs will be listed on each of these programs when the 2025 budget is established. Cost allocation, transfers to the general fund, and debt service are also included in the operating side of things. And so now Sam will talk about the master plan alignments and how that relates to the operating budget.
Thanks, Cole. So the department made efforts to tie our operating budget to the master plan in the packet this month. We're able to tie the current year budget for non-personnel and seasonal and temporary staffing costs to master plan strategies, and in a similar way as our approach during the presentation of the proposed CIP last month. So this chart shows combined investments of the 2024 operating NPE and NSPE and the 2025 draft CIP into the 5 master plan focus areas. You can see that a large part of the operating budget supports the financial sustainability focus area, which isn't represented as much in the CIP we reviewed last month. It includes strategies for taking care of what we have and investing in workforce development and operational needs. And programs that tie to these strategies support ongoing maintenance and operations work in the department, including reduction of the trail maintenance backlog, fencing replacement and repair, software application administration, and records management. Before we shift our focus to changes to the 2025 budget, I wanted to share where you would see information on questions or interest from the board after the May business meeting. So this month's memo included information on bike rack expenditures, a review of anticipated upcoming CIP projects, and a list of unfunded projects. These details were provided as a follow-up to questions from the May meeting or feedback from the board over the last several months. We won't necessarily cover this information in the presentation, but can answer any questions you may have. Oh, yeah.
We provided a list of unfunded and underfunded projects. Some of that on that list are receiving some funding, not just the full funding request. So unfunded and underfunded projects were part of that attachment.
Thank you. No, thank you. So the memo also details expected changes to the operating budget in 2025. We'll have more details to share about those changes as conversations continue with the finance department ahead of the July business meeting. We shared last month that we're expecting slower growth in sales and use tax revenues. We now have more details to provide here. Sales and use tax categories increased 3.8% from 2022 to 2023. And from 2021 to 2022, that increase was actually 11.6%. So this is some evidence that the expected slower sales and use tax growth is happening. Existing costs or base costs in the operating budget are also increasing. OSMP typically plans for a 3 to 5% increase in most operating budget costs annually. These increases get programmed into the Open Space Fund financial, which you'll be able to see next month. And as we shared in this month's memo, costs beyond that budgeted 3 to 5% are expected in the citywide categories for cost allocation, the Enterprise Technology Fund, which captures IT software and hardware charges, and the Equipment Replacement Fund for items like vehicle, fuel, and radios. We do still expect increases to other budget guidelines from the finance department, like our energy costs and buildings, but those will fall more into the range of 3 to 5% increases that the department has been planning for. So with the expectation of slowing revenues and increased costs, OSMP will focus on our highest priorities to set future work plans. The work planning process will continue to focus on prioritization and trade-offs with master plan tier 1 strategies, the strategic budget enhancements we shared earlier in the year, and the city's strategic plan as guidance to develop a balanced work plan. OSMP will still maintain the enhancements shared during the 2024 budget process last year, which are now part of our CIP and operating budgets this year. So we're continuing to pilot climate funding and operating in CIP budgets. We're maintaining open space fund support for enhanced forestry staffing, which was previously funded by the climate tax in 2023 and was absorbed into the open space fund this year. And we're working to retain seasonal and temporary staffing levels with possible changes to duration of terms. And closing out, I'll share the next steps for our remaining meetings. Cole and Dan mentioned that we'll be adding a budget agenda item in August. The July business meeting will include many of the details the OSBT will need to make an informed decision for recommendation of the 2025 budget, and Finance Department staff will also attend in July to present and answer any questions you may have. Next month's packet and meeting will include refined budget guidelines from the Finance Department, a draft open space fund financial which details the draft revenue, CIP expenditures, operating budget expenditures, and reserves that we've been hinting at, draft staffing levels, and changes to the draft 2025 CIP list if needed. Public hearing and recommendation on the 2025 budget will be moved from July to August. And if you have questions ahead of the July meeting, those are always helpful for us to receive in advance. We can work with the Finance Department and other staff to share detailed answers for your review before the meeting, like we did when we sent you information about cost allocation. Those answers were included as an attachment in this month's memo. Okay, so closing out, does the OSBT have any questions regarding the department's 2025 budget update?
And before we turn it over to the board, just thank you, Sam, for suggesting any questions you have up front. And just to give you a little bit of idea, finance staff questions versus maybe continuing staff questions. So our finance staff are, representing citywide budget development stuff. So kind of tailor your questions that you think you might have for them and that you maybe want to give us ahead of time so we can give them a heads up of what you're most interested in hearing from them. More at citywide processes, or perhaps those elements that are part of citywide funds, such as cost allocation, fleet and equipment, OSMP projects, OSMP budget kind of stuff. That's still more for us. So if you have questions that you want to, you're going to ask and you want to submit them ahead of time, and if they're for finance staff, kind of think of it in that way. And we'll be happy to share those with finance staff to make sure they're prepared to answer them. And maybe we'll put an email reminder out as we get closer to the date.
I'm really happy that we're getting another touch with this, especially considering that Sarah's not here tonight, and Brady, I'm sure they'll both watch the video and read the materials. But they're going to get a chance to actually listen next month, and we can actually deliberate in the August meeting and then make our recommendation in the August meeting. So I'm happy about that. Okay, what I'm also happy about is the bike racks. Thank you. But not without questions. So I see that you had identified Jeff and your team. And by the way, Cole, I'm sorry I didn't mention earlier that you were also staying and having to endure this heat. Not just Sam and Lauren, but it's more obvious that I think that we're suffering. We're like, okay, so there are 111 formal trailheads. There are bike and access points. And there are currently 50 locations that have bike racks. And so I know some of them are outdated, and you also want to put bike racks in certain places that don't already have them. And you're doing some analysis that starts this month, right? From June until October of usage, and that's going to yield some sort of analysis that's going to make you want to do other ones, I hope. So not just those 25. So my question is, you mentioned in here that there's an option of including the 50,000, basically a carve out from the trailhead enhancement renovation line and making that more transparent and trackable. So you're carving out $50,000 to address those 25 that need help right away or need addressing right away. But there's an option to include that in the 25 CIP, that carve out, or to do a carryover from the previous year into this year, and that would actually allow you to do some of this work this year. Two questions, what would and when would you make the decision to choose one versus the other? And then the second is, why not do both? So you have the money you could carry over. You're going to do some analysis, which is, certainly going to tell you that you need to do more in 2025. Why not do both?
So I think the 24 carryover, I might actually ask Cole. I think we're working through our carryover right now to look at savings and options. And so I would actually ask Cole to speak to, not to put you on the spot, but
But he is.
But since you're in the hot seat already, but that's kind of a current work that we're doing right now, looking at our carryover. I think I'll just say before Cole responds, we looked at that option because there are some savings or reallocation we could do if we wanted to be as aggressive and nimble and do the work as quickly as possible. That could be one option, and then not impact the trailhead renovation project for next year for 25. But I hadn't explored, let's just do both. But maybe first just chat about the 24 carryover.
Yeah, carryover is really something, when it meets the criteria of being carried over like an actual capital asset, it's really kind of up to department priorities on terms of like where we apply that money. So in theory, yeah, like if it's like what we're hearing here, and like especially last month too, that it is a priority. So like in terms of those things, like we would take our carryover and kind of apply it towards that. Like it's really more up to us in that sense, as long as it meets the definitions.
So when would you make that call? Like you have the money to do it and it is a priority. Would you make it by August when we have to
Sure.
cast a vote? Or would
You
you
mean
make
like
it?
August of this year for?
Oh, and if we did it this year using carryover,
Get off the mic. No, that's fine, Dan. I think you're probably going the same place. So with carryover, carryover is appropriated through adjustment to base, which happens in
It
now.
just happened now for
Right.
last year.
Now for last year. And then one of the things in terms of the fiscally constrained financial environment, I think we're also looking at carryover to fund department priorities, like Cole said, but as a possible strategy for meeting some of the increases that we're seeing otherwise. So when we look at next month and cost allocation increases is a potential strategy for funding some of these increases to deobligate carryover as well. So I think we're hoping before we would make any of those recommendations that we would have a full picture of what these numbers are going to be and then be able to compare those things. But I think what we've arranged with the finance team is that we'd like about 2 months to be able to make that assessment. So I guess I could say roughly August. I can't guarantee that that would be done in time for the budget recommendation, but that's really what we're looking at. The other thing to just be aware of, we have I think we talked about it in the memo, our work plan steering team. So we meet every month as a team and we look at emergent and unplanned funding requests for the whole department every month. So that could be a bid comes in higher than we think, or a project actually comes in under budget, and we have the opportunity within our appropriated budget to make those real-time shifts by putting in journal entries. So we're prioritizing those things all the time. So it could actually be that through this year, a permit doesn't come through in time, so we have extra money, or some other event might happen that allows us to transfer money into another priority project. So I think that the really useful thing for us in this conversation is hearing bike racks is a priority. We want to do further assessment, and then we can be factoring that in as we make those real-time shifts over the course of the year through the budget process.
Yes, and so would you need to know, to do that carve out, would you need to know by August? Because like the dollar amount's the same, right? You're still asking for the same amount. It's whether you're going to actually break this out, carve this out of the trailhead enhancement line and say this portion, this $50,000 is going to be dedicated toward bike racks.
You want to?
yes, and because we haven't gone through all the decision-making on the carryover, which is, I think we have meetings next week, and on that, I think we're just being a little bit like, we haven't come to decisions on that. But it's certainly something too that over the course of the next 2 months, we provided the board with email updates on budget stuff in between meetings even. So in terms of decision-making on 2024 carryover, or you'll see it reflected as a separated item out for 2025, we can depending on the timing for those decisions, we can either make it part of a future packet or provide you some email updates. But go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, that's correct. And in terms of, can we do both? What I would like to do is just go back to the staff team. Funding is one opportunity and brings about the ability to do work. Secondly, kind of like what Lauren was mentioning, our work planning and capacity to identify locations, procure contractors, and just check in with the staff what that ability and capacity would be with an increased dollar amount. So I guess I would say, again, in this spirit of research and understanding, maybe next month we'd come back with more information about, 24 and 25.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions about the budget? Is it okay if we have more questions next month because Brady
Yeah,
and
and that's
Sarah
why
will be
we're
here? Yeah.
encouraging some email questions ahead of time, because just to make next month a little bit more efficient, a chance to separate who should field these questions, give finance. If you all could be thinking about what's on your mind, we'll send you a follow-up email, and that would be great if we could do a little bit more of that for the next meeting.
Okay, I think we are ready for a director update.
All right, I do have a few. This will be about 20 minutes. No. Just a reminder, on Friday, we're going to be doing a field trip. Okay, boys and girls, sunscreen, comfortable walking shoes, a hat, and water. All right?
Who's driving?
Else, we're not going to let you in the car if you don't come with those.
But you're not
So,
driving, right?
Staff will be driving. We'll be departing the hub at 9:30 and returning at 11:30. A couple just want to make note that you've been hearing a lot about our new perimeter mowing program that actually started on Monday, and we actually completed the work at the Dakota Ridge at the north end. So if you want to know what a 30-foot mitigation swath looks like, you're happy to, and we'll be at Chautauqua, I believe, tomorrow, or Chautauqua was our next site, and then we'll follow up soon after with Wonderland and Shanahan. So just a FYI, and also with vegetation mitigation, noxious weed mitigation, and fire mitigation combined. The tall oak grass grazing, as we did inform you earlier, we're doing a new enclosure actually on the in-car property. We got permission from the federal government to put an enclosure so we could do spot grazing on the in-car, on a portion of the northern edge of in-car property. And that cattle is going to be moving in there next in the coming days. They're out lot D today. So just an FYI that we may hear some things about, wow, that's a new place for cattle, and it is. So we worked with in-car to get the permission to do that management, and they were very eager to do some fuel mitigation work on their property. So, and last but not least, no, that is it. Look at that. So, mic drop.
Last and least. Okay, so it is 9:28 and the meeting is adjourned. I'm not using the gavel.
Too violent.